You guys set?
Yeah, okay.
Cool.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition, another show, another 3 hours of the most disruptive show on the radio. In the politically independent corner, I am investigative radio show host and political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last ember in the darkness, burning in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, deep in the furnace of this world, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And together we're bringing you the news straight up. We have the headlines right afterwards. We have Jamarl's monologue. And after that, we're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. But first, in the news. Per NBC News, the House passed a bill on Saturday giving $25 billion in emergency funds to the U.S. Postal Service and reversing recent cost-cutting operational changes. Democrats are seeking to reinforce the agency ahead of the November election when many voters are expected to cast mail-in ballots due to the coronavirus pandemic. That House vote passed 257 to 150, earning some support from Republicans who expressed concerns about delayed mail. The bill is likely to meet significant opposition in the GOP-led Senate. On the rare Saturday session in August comes amid a national uproar over mail interference, putting the Postal Service and Postmaster General Louis DeJoy at the center of an unprecedented election year. The House will recess again until next month. Also on that story, by the way, a federal judge in Pennsylvania delayed the reconsideration of a lawsuit filed by President Trump's campaign re-election team, seeking a ban on drop boxes for mail ballots and on accepting ballots without a second internal secrecy envelope. That Pennsylvania judge has said he would possibly resume, consideration of the case before the election if other similar cases are decided beforehand. This also comes, Kellyanne Conway is now out at the White House. That happened overnight. A former campaign manager and longtime senior advisor to the president, Conway left saying she needed to spend more time with her family. This came at the same time as Kellyanne's husband, George Conway, stepped down from the prominent anti-Trump group he co-founded, the Lincoln Project, also saying he wants to spend more time with his family. This comes after their 15-year-old daughter publicly pushed back on her mother's decision to speak at the RNC, saying she may push for emancipation from her parents, legal emancipation from her parents over the issue, among others, I'm guessing. This is all connected. Of course, this has to do with the Republican National Convention, which kicks off today following the Democratic National Convention last week. It'll be starting today in Charlotte, North Carolina. President Trump is planning to attend that event in person this afternoon before accepting the candidacy on Thursday from the South Lawn of the White House. He will also apparently be speaking every night at the event, however, mostly remotely, with a huge number of other members of the Trump family joining him to speak at that convention. Maybe we can talk about this strategy later. Tomorrow we can come back to it. Meanwhile, over in Portland, we saw a major brawl last night in the city as right-wing protesters and Antifa fought with bats and people lit a police station on fire. This was the city's 88th consecutive night of protests. Meanwhile, over in Kenosha, Wisconsin, that city saw its first night of consecutive large protests. I'm guessing it won't be the last. There are big protests after police in the city shot a black man in the back as many as 7 times while they were responding to a domestic incident at about 5 p.m. on Sunday. That man was taken to the hospital in serious condition, whereas he is reportedly still alive now. This sparked same-day protests that quickly moved into what some called riots. Internationally, Pompeo will be visiting the UAE today and Israel tomorrow to discuss the two countries' normalizations of diplomatic ties and the topics of Iran and China. Meanwhile, officials from the Syrian government, its opposition government, and from civil society delegations will resume talks today in Geneva with the United Nations on either amending or rewriting the Syrian constitution. Major nations in the region, including Iran, Russia, and Turkey, and the U.S., are watching from the sidelines during this process. Back in the U.S., Tropical Storm Marco is expected to make landfall this afternoon along Louisiana's Gulf Coast. The National Hurricane Center in Florida says widespread coastal flooding is expected from Marco, with Hurricane Laura coming immediately after, with the two hurricanes expected to make a rare back-to-back landfall together. Hopefully over in Louisiana, people are okay. We know people, friends of the show, who are preparing for this. So hopefully they'll weather the storm. And in our last headline this morning, wildfires have burned over 1 million acres in California, with firefighters in at least 10 other states helping to combat at least 30 large fires in the state sparked by lightning hitting parts of Napa. One of the fires in Northern California is the second largest fire on record in that state. Fire personnel has more than doubled, but they're reportedly severely understaffed, with one spokesperson saying they could have as many as 5,000 firefighters there to help, but now only have about 1,500. And my last note, this is a sort of a personal note. I want to get more exact numbers. I just didn't have time. But what I've heard is that there is, and I've looked into it a little bit and saw some inexact numbers. Because of COVID, there were prisons that had to release prisoners because you had crowding and you didn't want to increase the spread of the disease. But a lot of the state's firefighter population apparently comes from the sort of forced labor population of prisoners. And without those prisoners in prison, the number of firefighters available is way lower than normal. And that seems to be making at least a part of the difference here. It seems like, there are more fires in themselves, but there's also less of a firefighter response. And there's largely less of a firefighter response because of that, because of the prisons having emptied. Anyway, that's the news. Those are the headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, what is your top priority today?
So it started off with a top priority of something that was taking place dealing with the USPS, but we could talk about that later. I woke up this morning around 5 o'clock to a Twitter storm of people angry at Rahm Emanuel. Now, Rahm Emanuel basically came out and said this will be the year of the Biden Republican. Now, as you know, Rahm Emanuel is supposedly a Democrat. Rahm Emanuel is Obama's chief of staff. And to a certain degree, there's lefties who have a certain bit of dislike about Rahm Emanuel. I would say when somebody tells you the truth, thank them. Even if it's a hard truth, accept it. The reason this is such a hard truth for lefties is because they know that in 2016, a socialist, if he would have applied himself, might have taken it. They know in 2020 that the Democratic Party was shaken to its core, believing that that socialist was going to run away with it. They know that during the course of this election campaign that the policies that they put up and everything else were popular, not just popular, won, with the difference being that the popularity of that didn't matter because what was up for grabs was the question of electability. And that if Sanders needed to win, he needed to fight on that very specific issue, punch and bite on that very specific issue. Look, you guys think he's more electable in the way they thought Clinton was more electable, in the way they thought John Kerry was more electable, in the way they thought Al Gore was more electable. None of it was true. Obama was a radical. And you need to fight from that point. You need to take every instance that you can get to hit him. Every time you can get the opportunity to wrap him in with the Democratic Party and how these two parties are basically the same thing. And I, Bernie Sanders, am something different. I am the man who's going to represent your interests. And fight on those terms. Tooth, nail, knife fight in the phone booth. You had to be that guy because that was the only way you were going to win this race. Sanders didn't have it in him. Joe Biden exceeded. Now, after this, and once you get to the point where Sanders loses, well, now we're back at status quo. And Joe Biden has hinted at this over and over and over again. So Rahm Emanuel saying this shouldn't be the thing that blows people's minds. But the thing is that lefties are being confronted with the reality that they get nothing out of it, despite winning the policy ideas. Even Medicare for all with 88% support. Whatever you want to think about that is good, bad, and different. You have to acknowledge that with 88% support and 70% of public support in the middle of a pandemic with tens of millions of people without health care, that this is something that at the very least is warranted from the standpoint of the public, but also warranted from the standpoint of the arc of history in regards to the United States growing up as a nation and accommodating and ensure that, yeah, if you're born here, it's your birthright. You're going to get health care. Even that could not get over the finish line. And even that policy, with near unanimous support among the party, gets across to you the level to which the Democratic Party does not care about representing the interests of the party because you are a captive audience. That you need to grasp that, and you need to grasp the severity and the reality of that. You incentivize your irrelevance in this entire process. Every time you're willing to say, okay, blue no matter who, okay, I'm going to swallow hard and vote for this person, okay, I'm going to sublimate my own issues. And understand this is sublimating your own issues in the context of an apocalypse. Your world has fallen off of its axis. And before Joe Biden can give that speech that has nothing in it, and you'll still go vote for that person. Think about what you've allowed for the moment. Think about all of the issues you care about. Healthcare, ensuring that people can eat, ensuring people aren't evicted, ensuring people have the ability to pay for themselves when they get older in life so they aren't necessarily after giving all of their mental and physical energies to this country, that they aren't left in the lurch. Those are the things you care about. Those things are worthy pursuits. But over the years, over the last 40 years, despite the fact that you cared about those things, you voted for a party that did not, at least not in the way that you did, which allowed the party to bring you in, scream unity, and then pursue their own interests by moving to the right. You, all along the way, believing it's pragmatic and that you had nowhere else to go. I'm making the point to you that accepting that line of thought has basically allowed you to ignore and not push for the larger issues in your society to get accomplished. Meaning, you've basically allowed that stuff to stay pat, status quo, and move further and further and further to the right. Never, ever having any notion or ability to get what you want politically. That needs to stop. Right now, all lefties should come to the conclusion that we are standing under a banner of Medicare for All. It has 88% approval. If you want to tack another one on, fair enough. But every last lefty, tens of millions of you, should step out and say, you will get our vote if you accept our policy. And you should also follow that up with, considering 88% of Democrats back it. Who are you representing? Considering 70% of the public backs it. Who are you representing? If you're not representing these people, there's unanimous support. And it gets across the level to which you don't support the interests of your party in doing that. And you should stand there and say, if the Democratic Party is willing to tank it to a man that they are calling the apocalypse, to a man that they accept will win the House, the Senate, and the presidency, a trifecta, a checkmate. If the Democratic Party is so purist that they're willing to not acquiesce to a policy that has nearly unanimous support within the party and is warranted just based on the context of our world itself, if they're not willing to do that and they're willing to lose it to Donald Trump, tank it to the apocalypse itself, then what does that mean about the party? How can they justify not backing a policy that has 88% support? Now here's the catch. The honest reality of it is they know you're not going to do that. And because they know that not going to do that, they will parade a bunch of Republicans on the Democratic stage to take swipes at lefties. Joe Biden, in one of his campaign things, had already told people in a room of plutocrats, nothing is going to fundamentally change. I'm not in this to demonize the rich. Nothing is going to change. And despite all of the policies that Joe Biden told you that he was going to pass in order to buffer up against Sanders, policies, by the way, that was less like than Sanders, meaning a people's agenda, less than that, to the right of that, a purist party. Because I can show you what the public said they want, and I can show you what Democrats want and what Biden is talking about, and none of those things meet. Because at the end of it, Democrats are a purist, radical party. They feign it with this notion of moderation, but that's just talk. Real terms, what the public wants versus what they offer. Biden had already told a group of people nothing is going to fundamentally change. The rich. He's telling plutocrats that. He gives that tone-deaf speech. But before that tone-deaf speech, he was also in another room with plutocrats. And second question was asked. Basically, an event was headlined by John Gray, top executive at Blackstone Group, a private equity behemoth at the center of climate, healthcare, housing, pension crises. Second question was asked by Mr. Gray, who noted that there are a bunch of business leaders on the line. What do you think is essential to getting the economy up and going? Biden. I'm Biden's associate who is working with Biden in his campaign. He says, I come from a corporate state of America. Many of you incorporated here, said Mr. Biden. It used to be that corporate America had a sense of responsibility just beyond CEO salaries and shareholders. Corporate America has to change its ways. It's not going to require legislation. I'm not proposing any. We've got to think about how we deal people back in. Now, he's telling this to them. They tried the Republicans on stage. Rahm Emanuel, this is the year of the Republican. And of course it is, because they can no longer trust that lefties will accept the position to which they have, in which case they are creeping to the right to try to ignore you that much more. It's rational. It's logical. It's what they're doing. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault lines.
And we're back live. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. By the way, we're taking calls real quick, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Also, if you just so happen to be in the Washington, D.C. area, you can listen to us there on the radio. We're on 105.5 FM, 1390 AM. Also, we're on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. And we're online all over the place. Our audio options there, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify. I'm missing one. Oh yeah, Apple Music also over there. On video, you can check us out on YouTube. Just do a quick search for Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Either one of those will take you to our morning daily live feeds. Over on twitter.com/faultlinesradio, right up top, you'll see our live Periscope feed every morning. Anyway, Jamarl, coming back, you were talking about Joe Biden making concessions. What you can foresee in a Biden presidency is another way to look at this. Making concessions to the corporate world. Of course, that's just what government does these days, apparently. Another way of looking at this, man, people, I'm going to sort of push back on something you were saying, but I'll use the main topic of your monologue to do it, and then I'll kind of respond with my own thing. You were saying that the left moves further and further to the right. I've noticed that the right thinks the right moves further and further to the left. I would argue that something else is going on here. I would argue that if you add another dimension to this chart, instead of it being a spectrum or something like that, where you're moving along the spectrum, either further left or further right, you can add at least one more dimension, which is something like whether the belief that you're considering benefits the status quo establishment, or whether it's promulgated by the sort of grassroots, whether it's sincerely held to by the grassroots. Now this isn't a perfect thing, because there's you can move. You might want to add something else to this, because there's some things that both appeal to the grassroots and that are good for the establishment. Sure. But if you take it as a sort of simple model, I think there are a lot of things that, like, the establishment wants, the current status quo, the current rent seekers in various positions of power, there are current beliefs that benefit them, and then very clearly in a lot of cases there are other beliefs that don't benefit them, that are actually held by people. And it seems like what happens to me is, when you see the Democratic Party moving to the right, they're moving towards the establishment right. They're making concessions to those positions on the right that are held and would advance the interests of people currently in power, that are held by them and would advance their interest. And the same thing when the right moves quote unquote left. They're moving towards the establishment left. Really, what it is, it's not some shift philosophically, at least it's not caused by that. it's just making concessions that you need to make to maintain your power as a party. You see what I'm saying there? This is what I want to push back on. And I think that ultimately, if you see it this way, then the political thing is just revealed inherently as a sham. If you're able to separate it out, what we would need, and we've talked about this, I think, on air before, you'd need almost like 4 parties. And I think if you had those 4 parties, you would see a much more honest space in our political debate. But if instead of just having the left party, Democrats, and the right party, the Republicans, if you had 4 parties where it was like the establishment left, the Democrats, the new left, something like the progressives, the establishment right, the Republicans, and then the new right, I don't know what you would call it. You might have called it alt-right at one point until that was revealed as racist. Now you might see it as Trumpian or something, but again, that's too personal. I don't know what you call it, but the point is, if you had these 4 parties, you'd have a much more honest representation. And chances are good, people would flock to the grassroots parties. Over the course of a couple of years, maybe a decade, not only would there be a better conversation, but I bet that people would shift, a lot of them, the popular vote, so to speak, would shift to supporting these more grassroots parties. I think at least it's a more honest, mental model, though. That's my take. What's your take, Jamarl?
No,
and again, we're taking calls
that.
202-521-1320.
I don't doubt that. To be fair, I did say Democrats. I didn't say lefties. I don't think I did. The left hadn't really budged its position from the standpoint of policy. The left was very clear on what it wanted: universal health care, universal education, etc., going back for 40, 50 years. No, I meant Democrats. So if I said the left, I apologize. I didn't mean that. And when I say Democrats, I mean the party structure itself. That the party leadership has a very specific incentive structure and an ideology that has them move fervently to the right. And what I mean by the right, I mean corporate. I just mean accepting money and then doing the favors that are incentivized by accepting the cash. So that's all I mean by that. So if the left or if the right wingers have their own idea of this kind of shift also, then fair enough. That's fair. But I try to impress upon them that in the left party, in the right wing party, or in the Republican Party, there's no contradiction there. Like, if you're talking about Democrats and you're talking about lefties, where you're basically talking about workers in the exact same party as their bosses and believing that these people have this kind of shared interests. Now, I would say integrity and relationships that are based on shared interests have a power dynamic associated with it, that as long as there's leverage within the context of that power dynamic, then yeah, you can get this kind of shared interest where the people are pulling together. But that's not what's happening in the Democratic Party. What's happened is you have a Democratic Party that basically tells this other party you have nowhere else to go. And you have lefties that weirdly accept the quirk of that argument. Because that argument can be looked at in 2 ways. That's not a singular argument. It's given as propaganda to force lefties, and then all of these other people would just kind of go in line in order to get people in this kind of mindset. But that's not a singular point of view. If you're telling me that, hey, you are supposed to vote for that Democrat, and I turn around and say, well, wait a minute. I have all of these millions of people backing me, pushing for Medicare for all. What do you mean I'm supposed to vote for that Democrat? That Democrat is supposed to acclimate this position. I am the one with the overwhelming majority. They are not representing the interests of not just their own party members, but their own public. So why is it my responsibility to back a party that is not going to appropriate this? Now, you can tell me I'm being a purist. I'm going to tell you the party is being a purist and not accepting a policy with 88% support. And my point is, it's a point of view that you either accept. And for the longest time, all of these media outlets and everything else, the lefties accepted this nonsense because they didn't realize that they were popular. Meaning, if you never get AOC coming out and saying, hey, we should tax these folks, and the public says yes, and the media is like, whoa, I can't believe they wanted that. Or if you can't get AOC or what saying Medicare for all, and the public says, yes, I like that, then you can give this point of view of a Rahm Emanuel or Obama or Biden that says it's not popular, but that's not true anymore. And the moment that you stand under the banner and say, look, you get our vote when you acclimate to our policies. It is your responsibility to do that as a politician. It is your job. Like, people get it twisted. It is not the responsibility of the individual to vote for Joe Biden. It's a responsibility for the candidate to get their vote as a flat fact. And if I'm standing here, and if tens of millions are standing here with me, and all of these lefties are saying, well, not even lefties, independents, Republicans, just standing on the policy saying you get our vote if you support our interests. And the party is willing to say, kick rocks to a policy with 88% support, 70% support out in the public. And not just that, we're in the middle of a pandemic with millions of people that have lost their jobs and all of these people without health care. And the Democrats are running as if this is some regular status quo year. No. It is a quirk of point of view. And my point of view is that you should be willing to not be a coward, to take the ethical and moral position of saying, no, this is what we need. And that party is either going to burn and explain how a man they are calling the apocalypse, and they weren't willing to acclimate to a policy that was fiscally right, morally right, ethically right, and right for the time frame of our time. So I understand that Republicans may take a point of view of that stuff of the party movement, and I agree with you. It's corporate interests. But at this point, you might as well just call it the Republican and Democratic Party. Like, to make the distinction here, when really it's corporate leadership of these parties that I think people are complaining about. And it's kind of what I'm trying to put my finger on and say, they don't like you. You're not that interesting to them up until the point where you get their vote. And by the way, this is what Clinton did in 2016, thinking we're going to get these right-wing votes, and we're going to be able to replace the lefties. And these lefties are getting, irascible. We can't control them in the way we used to control them, so we need to find something else. And then they kind of lean to the right, and Republicans are like, no, we're backing that guy. Now, whether that works with the Biden model, where he can have all of these Republicans trying out on stage or not, I don't know. If it does work, the left at that point has very clearly signed over irrelevance in regards to anything that they want in pertaining to the Democratic Party. And they need to go home on this notion that they're going to push Joe Biden with invisible leverage that doesn't exist. Shane, we haven't called it, but Shane, make your point.
Well, yeah, I'll just real quick, I can make it, because we are taking calls 202-521-1320. We probably just got time for maybe one more after we take Tarif. Come to in just a second. But 202-521-1320, again, is the number to call. Jamarl, my point real quick. My brain keeps working weirdly when it hears this stuff, and it keeps going to this problem of institutions. And I'll put it like this. It's like it's just my sort of abstract view of things. You have too many levers of disassociation. You have too many levers, basically, in between where the change needs to happen and who's making the change. Where you talking to me and me talking to you, we're sort of speaking under the presumption that we live in this society where we are ourselves political agents, where we can hope for change, where we can make change in our lives, where we're at least participants in the system that can make change. And yet at the same time, the content of our conversation, much of it revolves around how absolutely intractable our political system is. I think part of that is that we're so gosh darn far from the actual levers of power. Now, that might be tautological. It's literally what I just said, is we're far from it. But here's part of what I mean. If what you need to do, I'll just give you an example. If one of the things you might need to do to repair your society is like fix the organizations that run it, but I don't even know how many. It's like, the Kevin Bacon, how many degrees are you away from Kevin Bacon or whatever? How many mutual contacts would you have to count before you find yourself with Kevin Bacon? Is it 2 connections or 3 connections or 4? It's like, how many steps are we away from actually being able to change whatever it is that we're complaining about? Is it like 5? Is it like 7? How far are you? How many people would you have to interact with? And therefore, how long of a lever, how much power would you need to actually change these things? We need to shorten those levers to whatever extent we can. We need to bring people into a feedback loop with the reality of their political situation, because otherwise, in the same way that the Democratic Party isn't accountable to the American people, we're not going to be accountable to reality. If we can't influence, if we can't be, not just influenced by, but if we can't influence our political systems, we don't have a grasp on them, then I don't know how the hell we can hope to manipulate them or control them or improve them. If we literally can't affect them, that's my point. That should be the sort of sine qua non. That should be the primary focus, the cause without which not. That should be the thing that we move from, is getting to that position of power. Anyway, we've got Tarif calling in from
real
New
quick,
Orleans.
just 30 seconds.
Let's go to him real quick.
30 seconds.
All right.
That's an illusion. I'm agreeing with you that that's true. We do need to have the ability to influence the lever of power, but that's taken. That's not given. There's no situation where the levers of power will ever be given to you. There's theater, there's performative, but my point is the public itself, especially right now, at this very moment, every last lefty network, every last person that's an independent, every last person that's a Democrat, hell, even people who are Republicans could say, we're not accepting this. Now, this would have to take place on the left, meaning from the standpoint of Democrats, but if those people said, you are not getting our support, period, that's active. That's an aggressive action of saying, we are not voting for you in this kind of automatic way anymore. You get our vote when you accept our support. That's a public getting active and assertive. The public could do that. Whether the public does it or not, because it has in its head, this is all that's possible, is a secondary thing. That's a factor of imagination that's been brought over for 20, 30 years. But I'm saying it's possible. It's just not ever accepted. That's all.
All right, well, how about this? Let's go to a break. We're going to go to a break early. We're going to be back taking Tariq's call. Then we're going to go quickly to Laith Marouf, our next guest, talking about Beirut and more. But again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Yo, Deshaun, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Tarif, we were taking calls last segment. We've got Tarif calling in real quick. Tarif calling in from New Orleans. What is on your mind?
I have three quick comments. Over the weekend, Trump says that he could decouple completely from China doing business with them. I don't think that'd be a wise thing. I think that's the neocons that's around him that he's surrounding himself with. He needs to get rid of them. We should work with China, but with a better fair trade for both sides. The second comment is dealing with Millie Weaver. We have that guy coming on today, Lifton Marouf. It will be good for It'll be good for like Millie Weaver, who is a Christian and a Muslim, to the Alex Jones crew, to work with people from the Middle East to find out what's going on. Because when it came out, that Shadowgate, they came out with these groups, these subcontracting groups that was probably behind these, the Maidan in Ukraine, then what's going on in Central and South America, dealing with Bolivia and stuff like that. If they can share evidence with each other, then maybe we can find out the names and who was behind turning Christians against Muslims and the Arabs against the Africans that was in Libya, and also overturning governments like in Nigeria dealing with Goodluck Jonathan and whatnot, because what she had posted was pretty good. You know, maybe it wasn't those two she posted last week, maybe some other contractor groups that we don't know, but if they share and come up with the names, then maybe they get Interpol involved, or maybe UN, and we can stop this what you call a revolution that's on both sides, you know, in Central and South America and around the world. My last thing, I saw the Plandemic series. It was pretty good. I agree with 90% of it. They need to be, the Congress and Senate need to talk to them too. So that's all I want to say this morning.
I appreciate the call, Tarif. Yeah, the thing with Millie Weaver, we haven't talked about that yet on air. I kind of haven't been able to make sense of it. Millie was working with InfoWars. She had a big media release or something. I hadn't really been following it, but she had a big media release that was due out. And then like on the same day that she was due to release this stuff, she was raided, I think, by the FBI, but it might have been local police. I probably would have been local police on like a domestic abuse complaint or something like that, or domestic violence. So the people who are in our sphere are painting that as oppression, suppression of material, basically. The idea that she was trying to get something out and somebody was trying to stop her. But I just can't tell if there was other stuff going on, and I hadn't been following her. But I think this is the second time you'd mentioned her when you were calling into Reef. We hadn't really talked about that on air. I'd heard about it. We're happy to talk about it more if there's more there. Sad for her regardless. But and then the first bit about subcontracting, what you actually, that wasn't the first bit, that was what you were saying she was talking about, what she was calling Shadowgate, about these various international subcontracting groups and contracting groups that would sort of foment unrest in different regions of the world. That's a fascinating topic. I mean, anywhere that the sort of quote unquote deep state reaches into the private sector and you get to see funding or association of activity when it comes to these private groups, whether it's an NGO, some nonprofit somewhere, or a company, corporation. Those are all very like vital grounds for inspection. Interesting stuff. We're trying to bring we're taking calls for a second. We're trying to bring Laith Marouf on the phone still. So we are taking calls for a minute. 202-521-1320 is our number. Again, 202-521-1320. We're taking calls.
Something else Sharif said, that Trump could completely decouple from China within X amount of time. That's an astonishing statement because I don't necessarily think that's true. Now, Trump does not have a great, let's say, track record with honesty and reality. So it could be bravado. Let's take it for that. But here's the problem. Here's the dilemma. If Donald Trump gets in office and he says, I am going to bring back jobs, great. How are you going to do that? Because basically, you as the president, how are you going to incentivize companies to do what is not in their fiscal interest? Because that's what you would have to do. You would either have to grow something here in the United States, but Republicans don't believe in giving money away, meaning they don't believe in putting money into the economy so that stuff can grow. So that's off the table. So how are you going to beat China over the head? How are you going to wrap them on the knuckles to get them to, what, give up the companies? And at that point, you're not even yelling at China. At that point, you're yelling at your own American companies for doing business with China, because that's basically what you're talking about. I have a company in the States. I can get rid of this worker.
I think the upside of that last part is that he can, if individual companies are complaining about it, he can still make it about China. That's the thing, is that you can reference something about the American interest or the national interest or whatever, and national security threats from China, and you can make it about how you have these companies who are basically betraying America in favor of economic advantage. Like, there are plenty of arguments to be made on that side, and you can hear him. You can hear me making them for him. I can just play.
Well, he was making them before. When he ran in 2016, he was making them.
Of course.
I mean, like that was the argument, right? That Clinton is the Democrats are a corporate party, and that I'm going to get these jobs back. And you think to yourself, how? Well, I don't need to tell you how. I'm just going to tell you that I am, and I'm going to tell you 1,000 times.
Well, but doesn't that work then? That's the thing. If he does that, if he changes the laws, if he changes the regulatory environment, all that stuff, the currency, which currency is the reserve currency, even like Mnuchin was making nods at that. If he makes those changes, then wouldn't you see that shift?
But he would never make those changes.
Like, couldn't we effectively decouple? That's my point.
Don't get me wrong. It's the question of can Britain separate from the EU? Yes, technically you can. But it's like a pain that is so, oh God, it's like, can I rip my fingernails out? Yes. Technically I can. Can I sew my own arm off? Yes. If I fall in a ravine and there's a bear coming at me and my arm is stuck, then maybe I could chew my own arm off like those badgers or something. But the pain, that's kind of like
what the decolonization with the UK, isn't that I feel like this is one of those sort of mechanical shifts that if you look at it, if you're going to be a materialist and you're going to look at the course of human history and the course of human society and politics and all this stuff, if you're going to look at it materially, doesn't this seem mechanical? Doesn't this seem like something that's sort of inevitable? Like, we have too much, we've been trying to maintain this empire. We've been trying to maintain the extent of that empire. It's starting to decay. We've gotten inefficient. We can no longer do that effectively, or at least we won't be able to soon. It's like the same thing that the UK went through with World War II and these other colonial nations. Isn't that inevitable?
Maybe. It depends. I mean, like inevitability has a thing to do with a strange thing. Like when we say mechanical, We're almost talking mechanical from the point of view of nations and the point of view of people now. And with human beings, there's this remarkable ability, whether or not it's used, to change your point of view. And we don't have to be in a world where we're trying to, at each other's throats. Like when I made this argument the other day, I was trying to make this case of integrity. Like, you are angry that the Democratic Party changed the rules on you. But integrity is not based on anything magical. It's almost based on a quirk of an outgrowth of two power centers that recognize their power centers. And so it's like, you can change your point of view on that stuff where you say, look, because it's kind of what Britain did, right? Britain eventually collapsed, but it didn't collapse in the way other empires did. It went in this kind of gradual fading away. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they just implode. And so could America have a government that says it's not zero sum? We can cooperate with China in a way where we acknowledge that they're a power center unto themselves and that they're going to grow and develop. They have every right to do that. Can we do that and come up with some level of cooperation? We did it to the Soviets. I mean, how do you think the war, Second World War was won? Like, there are scenarios that happen that get us, I guess, overcome our basic ideas of what we may want in the most of, avarice of situations to our higher angels. But it's hard to see those. It's just hard to see it. Like, I don't see America pulling back in that sense, nor do I think China is.
It seems like you'd have to. No, it seems like you'd have to. I think there are two ways you can look at this. You can look at America pulling back generally, which was sort of. What do you mean? Go ahead.
No, I was just asking which one is it where it's conceivable that they're going to pull back? I was trying to understand where you were going with it.
Well, I'm gonna take it in two directions. One, it is conceivable that we have to decouple from China. So I'm saying I think it at least as a sort of interim step. Like, if you think about it, I'll put it like this: there's some kinds of relationships. Say you have a relationship with a mentor, or say you have an asymmetrical relationship, a hierarchical relationship in your personal life with somebody. There's some people where that is the tenable kind of relationship. As soon as you're on a par with them, it becomes untenable. It becomes unstable, usually because of personal differences or whatever the case might be. I would argue that the same rule set can apply when it comes to nation states internationally, where a certain kind of relationship works based on the cultures, based on the interests of those states at that time. And then once a more even playing field, once it becomes more egalitarian, it stops working, at least for one of them. And it's that thing. We're at that point in our relationship with China. You can relate this to the Thucydides trap. My point is, there's not going to be a clean transition, a clean move from us seeing them as a lackey, in some sense, to us seeing them as an equal player. That's not going to be instantaneous, and it's probably going to come. Well, it's conceptual, but it's also it's also institute. It's also in the form of the institutions that are used to making all these negotiations, in the form of all the legal structures of trade.
You're right.
All that stuff. That's the machinery. That machinery is, there's like a hysteresis or a lag where that stuff just takes time. I don't know. That's the way I see it, at least.
No, you're right. You're totally right. I mean, think about if I'm in a stronger dominant position with you, and I make a deal with you, and you accept that deal purely because you recognize the dominance and strength of your position. What happens when they're not that dominant anymore? Do I keep and want to keep to maintain the way we had the relationship prior, or do I accept the upping, the up and comingness of it, the turn of the worm, and have this kind of gradual, okay, I accept that you've become better. I don't think that's typically done in a cordial way. I'm thinking just from chess. Like, there have been guys who I used to grow up with playing, and as you grow up with playing them, you're the kid, you're the one that come in, and then you have an exponential growth in your skill set, and you reach 2032, and those guys are still at 1400. Is it an easy transition for them to reconcile, oh my God, this kid is now dominating me to the point that I can't win anymore? It's not easy. The relationships and everything else get weird. Over time, it flips, but that flip is not a gradual thing, and I don't think that's true with the nations. I think you're right. I don't think it's just conceptual. I think it may start off as conceptual, but at a certain point, it becomes how people perceive it is different than the material mechanics of it. And that's where you're going to get conflict, whether that's war or whether that's one of the countries having to change. I agree.
Even when you say it's conceptual, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Even if you were to say it's conceptual, what is it to say it's conceptual anyway? I mean, people are social. If you were to think of yourself as a brain in a vat, or some sort of like, however you want to look at it, simulated or a Cartesian monad or something like that, where it's like an
Right.
independent, isolated, sort of solipsistic entity, completely subjective. If you wanted to think of yourself as that, maybe at that point, what's conceptual is subjective. But if we exist in a material space, and if we exist in a society specifically, what is conceptual is not necessarily just subjective. What is conceptual, or what is subjective suddenly becomes very objective, because you have these social bonds, these sort of obligate bonds, these ways of being that everybody else, everybody in a society can have, that creates a kind of a gridlock. So this subjective is incredibly important. In that way, the subjective is objective. And you need to deal with the subjects and with the
I don't agree with that one.
objections.
I so disagree with that. Because if you're a brain in a jar, wait, just 20 seconds. If you're a brain in a jar, you're not conceiving yourself as a brain in a jar. You're perceiving yourself as a body, as an arm, still in a physical environment and everything else. Meaning, whether you still see yourself in material terms. There's a material world that you engage with, but there's an overlay on that material world of how you view it, what it means, and all of that stuff. That's what I mean by conceptual. The subjective is important, but the subjective is important from the standpoint of a conceptual way in which you perceive yourself. There's a material and there's a subjective. But let's go to a break. I love these combos. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment. Stay tuned.
Fault Lines.
On Sputnik with Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert. Tune in.
Well, maybe mention like central bankers and markets are doubling down. Not you're saying everybody's doubling down. They're crazy.
They are. Everyone's crazy.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Lenman. We have a changing of the guards here, changeover. We're going to have Stephen Lenman on talking about Belarus, probably some other stuff too, but we'll at least start with that. Again, joined by Stephen Lenman, author, longtime author, and geopolitical analyst, also a longtime friend of the show, by the way. Stephen, how are you doing this morning? Here we had him. Oh, man. Oh, no. You know what we have? We're having some of the... Man, this is just... It's weird. I swear.
Oh, the phone line issues again.
We're having phone issues again. Exactly. Yeah.
Can we get him on Skype by chance?
We're trying to... No. I mean, it's problematic, and it's problematic while we're on the air. Anyway, no, we had him on the phones, but now we're having some sort of an IP issue with the phones. Oh, man, this is frustrating. This stuff.
That is frustrating.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about Belarus. I'm seeing, and I haven't actually seen a picture. I want to see a picture because a picture really is worth more than 1,000 words in this case. I'm hearing that Lukashenko has been carrying an assault rifle, has been, basically in response to protesters approaching his house. It's gotten to that level, but again, that seems to be what Western media would want to portray it as. I just want to see the picture. I want to see him actually wielding the assault rifle, and I haven't quite yet.
That is pretty hard. I want to see that myself. I want to see that myself. One more thing with the China thing, Belt and Road Initiative. I have to be honest. I heard that. Look, let's pretend for the moment that there are no tribes, just a world, and a world that decides it wants to do X or Y. And in these various spaces, each country decides on what it wants to do, what it wants to spend its resources on. We decide under Kennedy we're going to the moon, whether that's the highest of ideals or not. It was sold that way. And I got to be honest, if I was growing up during that time period, I would probably be running around with a hat of the NASA hat and my little thing and be excited, proud that we were doing this. Even if I didn't understand all of the, we're going to the moon for freedom and democracy, that stuff. I would still be enamored by the notion that we as a nation decided to take on a mission, a larger than life mission. Did we have to do it? No. Why did we do it? We did it because it was there. That's why the people climb Mount Everest. That's why, why does Rice play Texas? That type of stuff. It's there. People take on all sorts of challenges. And it's something to be said about deciding to put your intellectual acumen and your physical skill and abilities up against something that is God-made. Meaning this is not a house or somewhere we have to scale. This is basically the moon. Humanity, these apes are going to cobble together a rocket and throw fire out the back and get to the moon. And Kennedy has no way to know how to do it, but he prioritizes it as a nation to bring all of these people around to the same point of view. That is amazing. China, Belt and Road, is oddly enough, in an economic sense, something similar. But we have Stephen on, so that could be a conversation for another day. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Oh, good Lord. We did get cut off, but we're back on again.
Absolutely.
No,
Shane, go for it.
Loud and clear. Thank you again for joining us, Stephen Lenman, author and geopolitical analyst. Stephen, how are you doing this morning?
Well, I'm doing fine and watching events of the world and doing what I always do, doing more writing.
Absolutely. And by the way, for everybody listening, you can read Stephen's writing over at stephenlenman.org. Go to check it out now. StephenLendman.org. Again, stephenlenman.org. Stephen, thank you for joining us. We're talking about Belarus today. I have found it, Jamarl. We were talking earlier about Lukashenko reportedly wielding an assault rifle, and I now see the picture. I've seen a picture coming out within the last 5 or so hours, 12 hours maybe, of him wielding this rifle. The reporting was that protesters were approaching his house. I don't know. What do you think is going on over there, Stephen? We've been reporting on this for the last couple of weeks. Things apparently getting more dire for Lukashenko, but again, that could be the Western media playing things up to try to precipitate his downfall. What is your take on where things are right now, Stephen?
Well, he's been the Belarusian president since 1994, 26 years. There was a presidential election on August 9th. He won the election, but he messed up. He rigged things to give him an 80% majority, which he did not get. He probably won by something like a 60% majority. He's more popular than unpopular in the country, and there really was very little chance that an opposition figure would defeat him. And the opposition figure, I don't have her name immediately in front of me, a long Belarusian name that's hard to pronounce unless I'm looking at it, so I won't try. A woman, the wife of another candidate who ran afoul of the government, and I think he's in jail. He shouldn't be in jail, but I believe that's where he is. His wife ran. I think the U.S. got hold of her to use her as an opposition figure. So now she's a U.S. media darling. But Lukashenko won, and she lost, and there have been daily protests on the streets for over 2 weeks. This happens frequently in countries, and what's going on is very clear to me. I wrote 2 articles earlier about it. I'm posting 2 new ones on my website this morning. They're already posted on my website. Second one, first one is what's going on in Belarus is made in the USA. This is you can call it an old-fashioned coup attempt or a color revolution. And the U.S. has staged a lot of coups over the years, some succeeding, some failing. The first color revolution was by the Clinton co-presidency, as I like to call it, against Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia in 2000, and there've been a raft of them ever since. And the latest attempt is going on in Belarus. I don't think this one will work, but who knows? I don't know all the dirty tricks that the U.S. has up its sleeve. But I do not think that Russia wants another pro-Western puppet regime in Belarus, a country that is bordering Russia. Other countries bordering Russia are run by U.S.-supported puppets, U.S.-installed puppets. Ukraine, the most obvious one, but Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus will be another. And I call these countries daggers pointed at Russia's heartland. Russia does not want this, but it will not break the law to oppose it.
That's the interesting part for me. Like, when I look at this as, like, what would I do in that situation if I'm trying to hold off, let's say, something on my border? And it gets into this notion of, okay, what are the politics that are at your disposal versus what are you willing to do to prevent something that you may not necessarily like? And I think a lot of this really does boil down to Lukashenko. Can he maintain his position? But is it fair to say that just because he has people protesting, that is not necessarily indicative of Western media or Western powers getting involved? I mean, he's been in power for a very long time. And even if he would have won the election, you said yourself that a lot of the people there didn't necessarily like him being there, even if a majority did. So just like Trump won the election, you had millions of people come to the White House. That's not indicative of them pulling him out of his seat, even though it is indicative of a lot of people still don't like him. So I guess what I'm asking is, where does that go? Is if Russia's not going to get involved, this means that it's basically Lukashenko. But that's not necessarily, we don't know, I guess what I'm trying to say, that Western powers have gotten involved in this conflict. This can be entirely local to that particular government and the people of that government.
I think the ideal for Russia would be to have somebody other than Lukashenko running the country. And Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, has made remarks that, number one, Russia supports the people of Belarus, and I believe that. And Russia does not want to intervene in Belarus or any other country, but it will do whatever it can in a mediator role to try to resolve things. The idea for Russia might be, Lukashenko said he wants to do constitutional reform. I'd have no idea what he means by that. It's certainly a stalling tactic, but there could be some constitutional changes, getting together with opposition elements to get things in the Constitution that they may want. I think Russia would prefer an outcome like that. Change the Constitution. Lukashenko said when the Constitution has been revised, there'll be another presidential election. Who knows what that would be? That could be a year or two from now.
But Stephen, that's the problem. But Stephen, that's the problem, though. Like the root of the problem. If Lukashenko would have ran this election, it would have been a clean election. He would have won maybe by 10 points, maybe by 15, but he would have won. Then there's a legitimacy there that's almost enshrined by the vote total. By screwing around with the vote total, you've created this tipping point where the audience is saying, well, we don't know if you would have won. Meaning, from the standpoint of the public, we need you to go. And that is the only level that we're willing to accept, meaning the constitutional reforms and everything else become almost less than necessary in order to appease the audience.
Well, I must say, I believe these demonstrations did not happen spontaneously. They were well planned. They were orchestrated. U.S. dirty hands are behind them. I mean, this is the same pattern. The same pattern happened in Ukraine, except there were shootings from buildings across the street from the Maidan with people killed and security forces killed. This is what went on there. Maybe this is the U.S. plan in Minsk. I don't know. Has not happened yet. But some of the violence in Minsk was perpetrated by security forces, but a lot of it, which has calmed down, I believe, a lot of it was also by thugs against the government, which means U.S. thugs against the government. The idea, what I would like to see happen is something like a Crimea end result. In Crimea, there was a referendum that people overwhelmingly voted to rejoin Russia. They wanted a historic mistake corrected. Well, Russia has been discussing integration of Belarus with Russia for quite a long time, but Lukashenko has not been amenable to this idea. Now, maybe to save his bacon, he might go along with it, but Belarus was part of the Soviet Union until it dissolved in 1991. Ideally, for me, would be to integrate Belarus back into Russia again, and that would solve the problem, except the U.S. would scream and moan. I also believe that everything going on would have happened if Lukashenko won by a 51% majority. I think that the protests were planned. I think that people were mobilized to do what the U.S. wanted to. There could be elements from outside of the country involved in this. I don't know, but there are certainly elements in the country that are opposed to Lukashenko. But there are more Belarusians who support him than oppose him. But again, this has all the earmarks of a U.S. color revolution attempt, and I certainly hope it'll fail.
Stephen, I mean, one of the last things you brought up there, the prospect of Russian and Belarusian unification. We've talked about the Union State, this idea of a joint Belarusian-Russian Union State. What the problem with that? I mean, there are a few. Again, you probably brought up practically the biggest one, which is the United States. Other nations nearby pushing back pretty hard against that. But another one is, I mean, historically, again, Belarus used to be a Soviet state, but they are also the most Soviet state by far at this point. And the Russian Federation, as far as I can tell, is fairly over. As far as most of the population is fairly over their history as the Soviet Union. There's a lot of self-perspective and self-criticism, I think, when it comes to the legacy there. And so I could just see a lot of a fracas coming from the union there, ideologically, from culturally, institutions trying to join. In our last couple of seconds, what do you think about that? Again, going out in maybe 20, 30 seconds.
Well, I would like to see a referendum in Belarus. Let the people decide what they want. That's what I would like. And ideally, well, I don't know whether it could be open, free, and fair, but if that could be done in an open, free, and fair fashion, that's what I'd like to see. That is what democracy is all about, and that is what I support.
I would support that as well. Thank you for joining us. That was the voice of Stephen Lenman, author and geopolitical analyst. You can read his articles at his website, stephenlenman.org. That's StephenLenman.org. Just wanted to make sure you got that right. Again, Stephen Lenman, thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We've got another great 2 hours coming up, and we'll be back in a minute with the headlines. Again, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
In the politically independent corner, I am currently very excited about planning to buy property in a couple of years. No, I am investigative journalist and radio show host, James Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the news, let's get to the headlines. Per NBC News, House of Representatives passed a bill on Saturday giving a $25 billion in emergency funding to the United States Postal Service and reversing recent cost-cutting operational changes. Democrats are seeking to reinforce agency ahead of the November election when many voters are expected to cast the mail-in ballot due to the coronavirus pandemic. The vote passed 257 to 150 in Democratic-controlled House. And of course, this will go nowhere because the Republican Senate most likely will not take it up. We will have a larger conversation on that for various reasons, but we're going to be speaking with Chuck. He came to the show once before to discuss this. He was a union representative. He did an amazing job on the show, so stay tuned for that. A federal judge in Pennsylvania has delayed the consideration of a lawsuit filed by President Trump's re-election campaign seeking a ban on drop boxes for mail ballots and on accepting ballots without a second internal secrecy envelope. The judge said he would possibly resume consideration of the case before the election if other similar cases are decided beforehand. And down goes Kellyanne. Down goes Kellyanne. Kellyanne Conway is out of the White House. A former campaign manager and a longtime senior advisor to the president, Conway left saying she needed to spend more time with her family. This came at the same time that Kellyanne Conway's husband, George Conway, stepped down from the prominent anti-Trump group, the Lincoln Project, also saying that he wants to spend more time with his family. This comes as their 15-year-old daughter publicly pushed back on her mother's decision to speak at the RNC, saying she may push for emancipation from her parents on the issue. That is extreme, but I would imagine there's all sorts of currents that run through your household when your mom is for the president and your dad hates him, and you're a daughter that is stuck in the middle of that. So I can understand the difficulties there. The Republican National Convention kicks off today in Charlotte, North Carolina. President Trump is planning to attend that event in person this afternoon before accepting his candidacy on Thursday from South Lawn of the White House. But he will apparently also be speaking every night at the event, mostly remotely, with a huge number of Trump family members joining to speak with him at the convention every night. That's... it's his event. He can do what he wants. Meanwhile, Portland saw a major brawl last night as right-wing protesters and Antifa fought with bats and people lit a police station on fire. It was the city's 88th consecutive night on protests. The city of Kenosha, Wisconsin saw a large protest yesterday after police in the city shot a black man in the back as many as 7 times while they were responding to a domestic incident at about 5 p.m. on Sunday. The man was trying to get back into his car, apparently, as the cops put multiple bullets in him, with his daughters or his children in the car watching his dad die on the street. That man was taken to the hospital in serious condition. Oh, I'm sorry, not die, injured or deathly ill on the street. He's taken to the hospital in serious condition where he's reportedly still alive. This sparked the same-day protests that were moved into what some people called riots. Pompeo will be visiting the UAE today and Israel tomorrow to discuss the two countries' normalization of diplomatic ties and the topics of Iran and China. Officials from the Syrian government, opposition, and civil society delegations will resume talks today in Geneva with the United Nations, one either amending or rewriting the Syrian constitution with major nations in the region, including Iran, Russia, Turkey, and the United States watching from the sidelines. Tropical storm Marco is expected to make one catch up at the Syria issue. Right now, there's a report that's out that basically the United States is stealing Syria oil and has a convoy, meaning a company, to take that oil and transport that oil away out of the country. Syria is not a major oil producer, so the reason that they're taking the oil is basically to stifle and to choke that country. This also goes in line with the United States burning crops, Trump giving the order himself in order to destroy those crops, again, for the same reason, to push that country into famine. This is what we're doing. This is the reality of those things. The talks that are taking place with the U.S. on the sidelines, they may be on the sidelines from the standpoint of the talks. They are not on the sidelines from the standpoint of what they're doing actively and militarily, illegally in that country. Tropical storm Marco is expected to make landfall this afternoon along Louisiana's Gulf Coast. National Hurricane Center in Florida says widespread coastal flooding is expected from Marco, with Hurricane Laura coming immediately after, expected to make a rare back-to-back landfall. Wildfires burned 1 million acres in California, with firefighters in at least 10 other states helping to combat at least 30 large fires in the state sparked by lightning hits across parts of Napa. One of the fires in Northern California is the second largest fire in record. Fire personnel has more than doubled, but they're reportedly severely understaffed, with one spokesperson saying they could have as many as 5,000 firefighters there to help, but now only have about 1,500. Last, rumors are circling that Kim Jong-un is severely ill again. Now, again, these are rumors, so we can't necessarily know the reality of this, but at various points, this has come up. So I feel necessary to report it, but I also feel necessary to report it as if it is a rumor. We don't know it as a flat fact. You're caught up with headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So Shane, the story I really want to jump into, and we're going to get into this further with Chuck Zlatkin, it has to do with the Postal Service. Now, I tried Sunday. I had a family crisis that I needed to resolve, and I'm glad that I intervened, because typically I am not, let's say my mom is far more ensconced in my family than I am. I'm the one who says, hey, I'm going to go traveling for X amount of time and that type of thing. And even though I'm paying attention from a distance. But on this, I needed to get more involved. And so I spent my day doing that on Sunday. The story that I had on cue was the U.S. Postal Service and the Democrats coming together saying we're going to put $25 billion in the Postal Service. And for obvious reasons, right? The Postal Service is beloved by the United States. The overwhelming majority of the public love it. And on top of the overwhelming majority of the public loving it, what Democrats and what Republicans know, and what Trump knows right now that's probably circling in his brain, is that the chances for Republicans to win elections go up as the vote total goes down. A Republican is not going to go out and give a populist, real terms policy campaign. Trump did kind of, but you can see what happened to that the moment that he got in office. I'm talking about a real populist-driven campaign where the person is spending a ton of money, either on infrastructure, either for that matter on issues of healthcare, or for that matter on education or for jobs, whatever that is. And so from their standpoint, you're going to have special interests, special groups, and you're going to have people who care less about, let's say, getting that stuff back from the standpoint of government and more about some kind of special interest concern. So what they know is, or Republican dogma, Republican ideology, and it is right, as the vote total goes up, the chances of Republicans winning goes down. If they can get those mailings out to all of those people, then naturally, Democrats will have an edge in that Trump wants to blunt. So Democrats have every reasoning in the world right now, at this very moment, to say, hey, we want to get as many of these things out as possible. We want people to vote. Here's the catch, and the thing that draws ire for me. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party, bipartisan, passed that 2006 bill that utterly destroyed the Postal Service. Bipartisan. Nancy Pelosi was involved in that vote. Bernie Sanders was involved in that vote when he was in the House of Representatives with a yay. And all of these people are now wringing their hands like, oh, golly gee, the Trump administration is trying to destroy the Postal Service. No, this was a crisis manufactured by Congress when they passed and imposed the extraordinary costs on the U.S. Postal Service. The Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act was done in a Democratic-run House. The Democrats had the House. The Democrats had the Senate. If you remember, this was right after George Bush was basically a lamed-up president. He was screwed. Nobody in the world was going to vote for George Bush at that point. And George Bush was on his way out. And who was coming in was Obama and McCain. And it became clear that Obama was leading that race. But at the time, just like when Obama lost the House and the Senate, well, at that point, George Bush had lost the House and the Senate. And Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, and the other side. And they passed that act that attacked, undermined, utterly destroyed the Postal Service in regards to the problems that we're having right now that are being expressed from something that they did back then. And now the Democrats are acting as if, golly gee, these Republicans are so angry and tries to privatize the Postal Service, missing that the same donors that are putting money into their pocket are putting money into the Republicans' pocket, with the added bonus and added catch that there is an ideology about privatizing the Postal Service. And right now, with Trump doing all of this, they can basically sit back and act as if Trump and the Republicans did it all, when in reality, it was bipartisan. That aggravates me more than anything else because people don't know the history of it. They just assume that the post office is having difficulties. And seeing Democrats giving money, they may say, oh, look at the Democrats. They're trying to help the Postal Service out. Missing the very basic point that the attack on the Postal Service was bipartisan. And at no point did they make that Postal Service whole. None of that stuff. And why would they? If you had a Harry Reid heading the Senate and a Nancy Pelosi heading the House going after the Postal Service. That's astonishing. Like, I'm always, like, our history in politics is always fascinating to me. And I spent several hours trying to figure out, why did Sanders back this bill? Like, you know, it's Bernie. I mean, Sanders was the one who threw his body on the fire against Obama because Obama was trying to basically put in Republicans who would have privatized the Postal Service. But I kept thinking, why on earth is Sanders backing a bill that basically injures the Postal Service and make that much more likely? So I'm so glad we get to talk to Chuck today and get to, you know, go into the history of this stuff and what this $25 billion is going to do, if any.
Yeah, no, that'll be a good conversation. I mean, one quick thing, there was other stuff I wanted to get back to actually, but one quick thing with Sanders, saying he backed the bill in 2006, but then he with Peter Fazio in 2013, they actually introduced the Postal Service Modernization Bill apparently, which would have undone the 2006 ruling. I think we've talked about this on the air before. So with Sanders, it seems like he had some
maybe get along.
Well, a little bit of that attitude. Yeah, he kind of maybe at the time, and then he kind of wanted to walk it back later. Maybe I'm for some reason it's the simplest word, and I'm forgetting it right now. But he didn't. That's fair. He didn't like what he'd done, and he wanted to undo it.
He's like, I don't like the results.
Side of this that people don't bring up. Yeah, no, he probably saw what the results were. It was probably included in something. People probably weren't aware of what the impact of that was going to be, and then they passed the bill. The USPS quickly saw what was happening, started to report on it. The media picked it up, and I'd have to go back and look, because I'm sure we'd be able to see the timing. The one side of this that I'm surprised to hear people not talking about now is Amazon. It seems like Amazon doing pretty damn well during COVID. Amazon heavily subsidized in a weird way by the USPS using their low rates, obviously under pressure from Trump, so maybe this doesn't fit the Democrats' narrative. But I'm a little bit surprised that Trump isn't bringing them up more. I'm surprised that Amazon in general isn't coming up in conjunction with this argument. It seems like we're talking about like a bureaucracy, basically, like where the Republicans want to shut down the bureaucracy and the Democrats want to keep it going. In the simplest terms, on the most abstract level, looking at it from that perspective, that seems to be what's going on here.
But it's not a bureaucracy. I mean, the Postal Service just does its thing. Well, I mean, it's a thing unto itself.
Well, a bureaucracy is not a bad thing, but it is an institution that was built to build was built to serve a purpose, basically, and that purpose includes bureaucracy. I don't mean to denigrate it. I'm just saying it is a government organization built decades ago.
That's fair.
I'd have to go
I'm
back
adding
to
my
what
labels
was
to
done.
it. It's like in my head when people say bureaucracy, they're talking about like do you remember the movie the one where the Earth is being replaced? I can't think of the name of it. It was basically the people came, they were going to destroy Earth. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. And their planet, when they were going through the bureaucracy, that's a bureaucracy in my head, where it's like, go get a Form 5. Okay, now go get 13. Now go get 10. Take it to the sky. That nonsense. So I'm sorry. That's my fault.
I mean, that's also... No, totally. No, and it's, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, for one thing. Not Universe, but maybe they push there at some points. No,
no, you're right.
At the end of the universe. Anyway, no, but the USPS, the thing is, it feels a little, this is a sort of a side point, it feels like a bureaucracy. You go in to ship something with them, and, it's just a place, but you have to sort of wait in a line to go up to the counter. They're very clerical. I don't know, it just has a bureaucratic feel. That's why it came to mind. Technically, though, it doesn't fit exactly what I mean by that, because they're doing things. They're not just filling out forms. They're delivering forms that other people have filled out. They're sending your letters. They're actually doing stuff. So they're a valid institution. I wasn't trying to denigrate them. Anyway, there's somewhere we should go with this. We're going to pick it up on the other side. We've got to go into a break. We are taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. But yeah, I want to get into Amazon for a second. We should come back to them. We should also talk about tech, if you're down, Jamarl. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the legendary activist, educator, and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And you, if you want to call us, you can. We're taking calls. Our number is 202-521-1320. Again, our phone number 202-521-1320. We are taking your calls. Talking about the USPS, we started to talk about Amazon, and now I'm going to take it somewhere a little bit different. Here's why I brought up Amazon, man. It's not just this argument that the USPS has been subsidizing Amazon, or that the government, the government, not just with their tax breaks, but also by allowing them to use USPS at these very low rates, that we've been subsidizing.
Wait, explain
Amazon.
that. Just because the audience may not understand that.
Automation. Well, yeah. So for one thing, I mean, Amazon is able to get such high profits that they've been able to reinvest in themselves so successfully because they're given these huge tax breaks on reinvestment. Basically, to very dramatically simplify things, money that they're reinvesting in their company, even at a loss, which they were in for a long time during the early years, they get to keep that money. And so the government's subsidizing them in some sense through that. It's not technically a subsidy, but people who are in favor of regulation might call it that. And then they're also, with the USPS, I mean, here's the other way that the term bureaucracy feels a little bit appropriate, is that the USPS, of course, unlike UPS and FedEx, is a government-owned organization. They send first-class mail. They have certain things are their perquisite, and their rates are able to be fairly low. The rates are kept low because they're a government organization, because that's regulated. And so in that sense, the term bureaucracy feels a little bit more appropriate. But here's the thing, is because their rates are lower and Amazon is allowed to use their lower rates, we Americans are effectively subsidizing Amazon. We're effectively making it cheaper for this big corporation to use this government-owned entity to send their mail cheaply, even though, I mean, we benefit from it. We benefit from cheaper prices at Amazon, but of course, Amazon also benefits from it. My point is, there are a couple of interesting.
I was thinking that's slightly different. I thought you were going to go. Well, I thought you were going slightly different. I thought you were going to make the argument that basically, the post office, so places like FedEx or places like UPS, that they don't like to go the extra mile in rural areas, and so they would hire the post office to basically ship those packages on their behalf. So when Amazon is creating some kind of relationship with these other mail companies or whatever, that last mile is probably going to be the postal service because they give the best rates. I don't have an issue with the post service having their rates cheaper because they're not trying to make a profit. So they don't need to go in this notion of how can we hit people on the knuckles and then, turn them upside down and get as much from people. No, it's just an organization that tries to do mail and tries to do it right. And so, but they do, and other companies do take advantage. Yeah.
We could get into automation for a second. This actually gets to a really good point. So what are the different advantages maybe of having a government-backed organization like the USPS? It's like you're saying, you might be able to provide services to people either who need it and wouldn't get it under some other system, very simply, or you might be able to provide them better in some ways if you coordinate them sort of, if you do some of the sort of standardization, for planning, that kind of thing. Anyway, right. I want to, if you take a step away, move to like trains and the development of cars for a second. You had this. You had towns that were underserved because it didn't make economic sense for the train line to get built on them, and so they were sort of backwaters. And then with the development of cars, you had this dramatic change of the way that society, the world around, the economy, people lived, everything, the development of suburbia, all this stuff sort of conjoined together. The point is that like you had this technological shift where you had an economic bottleneck that was restricting people, and then you had a new technology, and for all cars' problems, they got rid of that bottleneck. They dramatically changed the nature of that thing. We're talking about maybe getting into automation in this conversation about USPS. Maybe we can get into it with Chuck too. It seems like there's room for the same thing. If there are areas that are currently underserved, maybe the reason for that is that it's too darn expensive to supply everybody with equal services, and so you have to play this triage game. If you had a technological breakthrough, if you had something like automatic delivery or increased automatic sorting or dramatic, if you didn't need nearly as many people to do nearly as much work, and it were made simpler with technology, then whether it's a private or a public enterprise, whoever's doing it, it gets cheaper, it gets easier, it looks better from every angle. I wish we had more of that. And I'm worried that our conversation on so many different planes and so many different areas of our society is held back by these stupid political gridlocks that are literally decades, if not centuries old. In the case of the USPS, I'd argue it's closer to decades than centuries. Maybe in a broader sense, it's a little bit older, but still. Can't we just solve the fundamental problem, which is that it's expensive to do stuff because we haven't figured out cheaper ways first? Like, can't we do that? Like, and if we did that continuously, would it even matter, if that makes sense? Because we're just solving.
Shane,
like, you get my point, Jamarl?
I am on your side 1,000,000,000%. And I know what you're saying, and so don't misunderstand. I totally get it. This goes back to the Jack Fresco view of the world. You have a problem, you figure out how to solve it, period, and you move on to the next problem. And if that's delivering mail, then that's not a political question. That's a technical question, if that makes sense. And most of the things, believe it or not, in your society are technical questions that become political footballs. And so it's like, all right, how do we get mail to everybody in the country in an adequate way? Now, the catch here, though, is this became that much more apparent with COVID. And I think part of the problem is that at no point in our society do we really ever stop to say, what changes do we need to make? It's just slow-moving momentum from where you were in the past. And so at one point, the mail was the only way that you had to get rid of the stuff. And then you get private companies that say, we want to compete with the mail. Well, at that point, you have a system of doing things. Then it becomes, well, wait a minute. Is there a cheaper way to do that? Well, that's never asked. Because your society doesn't function in that way. You have people who have jobs. You have people whose jobs would be disrupted if there were that technology that came out. You have companies that may want to appropriate what the mail does or what the post office does. And when it gets to the point for them where they find something that's dirt cheap to do, they re-implement. And by the way, if they re-implement that, the same rules apply where it may affect the post office, where the post office may not be able to compete because those companies come up with a cheaper way of doing it. Yeah, I agree with you, man. 1,000% I agree with you.
Real quick, I knew you're a Star Trek fan. I mean, think about it like this, from USPS's perspective, from anybody's perspective. If you invented a teleporter, you would solve everything. You would just completely
right.
Right. I mean, no, it's more.
Or if there was a
drone,
drone,
potentially, or whatever. I don't know. That's the thing. It's more drones and
or if there was a robot,
cars, or again, like, yeah.
But see, that's it right there.
Yeah.
This problem has already been solved, believe it or not. It's to such a degree. I mean, it needs to be slightly ajar, but it's already been solved. They have a robot that can get out of a car, walk to a house, drop a package. You have a solar-powered car that goes from point A to point B without ever needing to stop for gas. Or even if that car is automated where it needs gas, it still has the capability to automatically find, based on a Google map, free device, a service station to get its fill to keep going. It never has to stop. It never has to get service unless something is breaking down. And even that part gets automated. So you have a simplistic device that drives for maybe $2,000. And that simplistic device, very minor in what it does, goes from point A to point B, picking up, dropping off packages. You've eliminated human beings almost from the entirety of that process. Now, people would look at this and say, oh my God, but you also think, how much does that cost now to deliver that package? The problem is your society has no mechanism to ensure that people are kept whole when you do that. That's your issue. The issue is not mechanical. The issue is societal. It's the societal device of economics, how people get made, how people get cash, and what's going to be the disruption versus whether your government is going to be able to accommodate those people in that disruption. And I'm sorry, we don't. Do you honestly believe that there's anything in the Republican or Democratic ideology that can accommodate that in any real way without calling those people freeloaders or just get other jobs?
Not in the current system, but that's where we're at right now. But again, I think these conversations change on the wider level. I think they just change. They just take time to change. And I think that kind of cultural mode or that status quo, you could shift out of that. It just takes time in some alternative system that's seen as viable, that's proven as viable. And first, I think we need to focus on that. But you know what? We've got to call it. I think we should go.
There is one catch. Mike, those systems seems to crash before they change to anything else. It's usually not a subtle slide over. Like think of slavery. Slavery crashed, not in this gentle slide over. It crashed in the fires of war. Think of Rome. Think of many of these countries. It's very like it takes. Well, it's almost like it has to expend all of its energies.
In the U.S. Well, no, because it doesn't do it everywhere. I mean, slavery actually. I mean, it petered out in other countries without war.
That's true.
Before it
That's
had to peter out with a war in the U.S. True. You know what I mean?
I'm thinking about agriculture. You're right. That's true.
Case, even when it's something as like sort of bloody and direct and suppressive as slavery, when it's something as close to the bone, and ideally we're not talking about hopefully it would be a technological change of a sort of similar magnitude of ethical good. You know what I mean? Where you freeing people to that same extent. I just don't. Looking around, I don't know. But
the question becomes
arguably people.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish.
No. I mean, here's the other thing. We should go to. I was going to say, arguably, some people equate like capitalism or like forced wage labor to slavery, but that's its own can of worms. We've opened up too many. We've got a caller. I think we should go to him if you're down.
Absolutely.
Michael,
Silver Springs.
Michael calling in from Silver Springs. You're on. What's going on?
Yeah, I was going to say capitalism is slavery, and all of the problems that we have is based on money. And in slavery days, there was no money that existed. I mean, as far as now, in 1700, there's no money. So capitalism.
Well, yeah, there was.
I mean,
no, that's not true.
Okay. Well. I mean, if there was,
I'm a critic of money. I don't mean to cut you off, Michael. We have a minute. I'm a critic of money. I recommend this book, Debt: The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. Good book looking at the origins of money, but money is way older than 1700. Money's been around.
That's a really good book. Actually, Shane put me onto that book.
Years.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
it's been around for a while.
I'd love to get that guy on as a guest. Anyway, Michael, go ahead. Sorry for cutting you off. Just wanted to throw in that plug there. But Michael, go for it.
Okay, thanks. No, I was just going to say that was a start point, but the Gadsden Purchase was they bought like an acre, a mile of land for like $15. So I mean, but I'll read the book. But I just want to say capitalism is money. And also, did you guys notice that at most post offices, there are a bunch of drugs. There's a lot of drug people around most post USPSs. And that's all I want to say.
Wait, did you say drunk? What was the last word you said?
People, I think mostly heroin and other people, if you keep your eyes open.
You mean that like to hang out at USPSs or like near USPSs? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Oh.
What's with that?
I guess I've seen that. I mean, that seems, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, yeah.
That hasn't been my experience.
For some reason,
I love the post service.
Okay, you know what? I said I don't think I actually have. I just think that USPSs seem to be poorly maintained enough that I could very easily see somebody, especially because it's like a government agency. I don't know. I could see if you're homeless or something like that, I could see that being a slightly more desirable place to stay than others potentially. But I don't know. That's outside of my.
I would say this: the post office should be our institution in this country. It should be a service. It shouldn't be separate. Meaning, if you have any other service, you have to pay for your military. You have to pay for some of these other things. It does amazing work, and in their case, they pay for themselves mostly. If we had to add something on the top to make that work, I have no issue with that. And I honestly agree with you, Shane. This should be one of those things of how do we make this cheaper? How do we make this better? And how do we find ways to use technology and everything else to cut the cost of this? What you're going to hear, though, is that the capitalists, FedEx, UPS, they're going to howl. And they're going to say, we can't compete with that. We should say as a society, we don't care. This is for our interests. It would be if it was like healthcare. Somebody says, yeah, you could do that cheaper and that person may benefit from that. But hey, we can't compete with that. So you need to increase the cost of the people when they have to have cancer treatments. It's like, I don't care. This is something that I think is a vital service. And I agree with you.
Well,
Technology should be one of those things.
It's not just that they can't compete with it. I don't think it would just be that. I think more specifically, it would be that they would say something like it's corrupt or it's inefficient or it's not run well, and it would be run better if we, the corporations, were in charge of this stuff. And they might be right,
but none of those things are true.
I think that would be the
Yeah, none of those things are true. I'm talking about just honest reality of it. It would make it difficult to compete if the Postal Service revitalized itself and start doing things much, much cheaper than what it already was.
Well,
they complain now that it's too cheap.
Fundamentally, the problem I see. You want innovation, and you have different possibilities, different sectors. It's too. You know what? We don't have time for this, man. We've got to go into a break. It's sad because you know what? Every conversation we could have for about 5 times as much time, and it would still be fun. We've got to go into a break.
It's can of worms.
We're going to be joined in this next segment by Chuck Zlatkin talking about the USPS, continuing a lot of the topic from this segment. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Zlatkin. We are joined for this segment and the next by Chuck Zlatkin. He's legislative and political director for New York Metro Area Postal Union. Chuck, how are you doing this morning?
Very good. Thank you for having me back to talk about this topic.
Hey, thank you for being willing to join us again so soon. This is obviously timely and important. We were just talking about this, actually. So right material here. What do you think about what's been happening over the weekend? What do you think about the House bill that got passed? Obviously, we're expecting some pushback from the Senate, from Trump. But what's your opinion on what's been taking place this weekend and before that, where we are now?
Okay, well, on Friday, I listened to Postmaster DeJoy's testimony before the Homeland Security Committee. And then on Saturday, I listened to the entire debate before the vote. So the fact that I'm still functioning is amazing, listening to all this stuff.
Good on you.
But I'll tell you, see, to me, all right, the bill is passed, and I think it's a no-brainer that the policies instituted by the Postmaster General, an hour and a half after he took the job, basically, during a pandemic and in advance of an election, poor judgment on his part. But so the bill makes sense to me, and $25 billion to the Postal Service is basically there to make up for its lost revenue because of the pandemic and its extra expenses because of the pandemic. This $25 billion isn't to pay for old debts or to or new equipment or anything like that. It's specifically for this purpose. So clearly the legislation, made sense. And what most impressed me of anything over the weekend were the 26 Republicans who voted for the bill against the leadership, their leadership in the House, against President Trump, who was tweeting during the hearings that these are people who are listening to their constituents who are contacting them and saying, I'm having problems with my mail. Now, the statistics that just came out, the latest reports from the Postal Service itself, showing a huge increase in delay of mail beginning in July, right after DeJoy put in his cutback. So we're hearing from people, customers, our members are working all around the country, seeing with their own eyes what's been put in play. So even though my national
actually, Chuck, real quick, I just have a quick question about that specifically. I'll put it like this: say we were to look at this on a chart or something like that, and you were trying to look at it, and you're trying to understand what the chart showed you was historically how effective the Postal Service was, like how many people were receiving their packages on time, everything else taken into consideration. If you were to look at that chart, is there anything like this? Have there been any historical interruptions to the USPS and its services that would compare to this in terms of maybe natural disasters or war? We don't have the raw numbers in front of us, but just does anything spring to mind, or is this pretty unique in history?
Well, the mail has been delivered during wars. It's been delivered during hurricanes, natural disasters, whatever. I mean, I was in New Orleans right after the horrendous situation down there, and I was doing a report on what was taking place in some neighborhoods in the 9th Ward. There were no street signs. There was nothing left. The people were still, trapped there or living in those things provided by the government, whatever. The only people on the streets, the people that were keeping the neighborhoods together, and were the postal workers delivering the mail. They had been sent out to other areas for a few days, but then they came back. They were the only ones. I was taught they knew they don't need street signs to deliver the mail. They knew the people, where they were, whatever. It was an extraordinary thing. So I've seen postal workers in my career do extraordinary efforts to make sure that people got their mail on time. So anything like this jump from July over this period of time, creating all of this response from the public, no, I can't think of anything in my career or I've known historically that can compare to this. And considering the fact that it's been done, intentionally, and it's been led by the Postmaster General of the United States, I mean, my national union hasn't come out and called for him to resign or be fired, but the New York Metro Area Postal Union, the leadership of Jonathan Smith, that's our position. He should resign or be fired because what he's not fulfilling his own oath, and what he's instituted, delaying the mail and attempting to destroy the confidence that the American people have in the Postal Service, which is only, once again, people have seen how important the Postal Service is to them during the pandemic, postal workers getting them their needed packages and all that. And this guy comes in, and the first thing he does is to slow the mail, to damage that relationship, because people feel highly and like the post office because the post office delivers for them. It's reliable. If they stop doing that, that'll break that faith, and then that'll help facilitate selling to private corporations.
Because your point is that basically you have an institution that does a job extraordinarily well, and the public doesn't want to screw around with the fact that it does its job well. But if you can screw with the mechanics, if you can make it break where it doesn't necessarily do that job as well and increase the cost of that particular job, and the public loses faith in it, then it's much more likely to allow for the privatization as opposed to right now where you can't necessarily pull it off. You said something else, Chuck, that I think is phenomenal that people need to sometimes consider. Responsibilities that people sometimes have in things go beyond fiduciary relationships, and they're deeper when they do. So the person who decides he's going to die fighting for his country, well, clearly no amount of money you can give him is going to compensate him for the death that he's willing to give, but he does so because he believes it's right. Well, same thing with people who are delivering packages, same thing with people who are taking care of parents. Their responsibility for these things go beyond just some kind of fiduciary relationship where they get cash. Doctors, for example. But I think our postal service is the same way. Like you say, in the middle of Katrina, in the middle of COVID, in the middle of the Civil War, these guys were still out there doing their job, rain, hail, sleet, snow. And I would imagine it takes an eternal responsibility of a person to do something like that. Tell me something else. How were you guys losing money during the pandemic? When I look at stores, like Shane bought at Amazon, for example, and you have all of these packages that are being delivered to people's houses because all of the retail shut down and people didn't want to go to the stores themselves. I know for my wife, she started using Amazon just for food deliveries in and of itself. So why was there a cut in cost? It seems like there should have been a revenue boon during the time of COVID. Why was there a depreciation in revenue?
Well, we have to look at the whole picture. Yes, package business went up, and that's what's keeping it going longer than anticipated. But all the first-class mail, all the business mail, it was not taking place. Businesses were not doing advertising, announcements, or people weren't sending things out because business wasn't going on. There was a 30% drop in mail volume, and that's including the jump in package delivery. So yes, there was definitely a fall off in revenue. Post office functions on the sale of stamps and services, gets no money, no taxpayer dollars go into the postal service and haven't for 50 years. What the point is that when this fell off, then also it was the increase in cost to function because you had 40,000 postal workers quarantined, 2,500 with the virus, 75 died. The mail still has to go, so people had to get PPE. They were paying overtime to move the mail. Now, let me make one thing clear about overtime. Overtime is the policy of postal management and has been for some time because they decided it was cheaper for them to use overtime when necessary than to hire full-time workers with benefits and whatever. The union's position is we want as many people to be getting 40-hour weeks and a decent job as possible. So it's not like the union is pushing overtime for some of our workers. No. We would rather have no overtime, but fully staffed. But what you can't have during a pandemic is no overtime and not fully staffed. So this great logistics genius that came in here, he saw that and he went further. Okay, no overtime. Then the other thing, we have to get on schedule and we have to be prompt. So let's move the trucks out. Let's move the trucks out on schedule, even if they leave without mail. It's insane. Postal workers, it's in their DNA from the beginning. From the first day you work, you're told that delaying the mail is not just a bad policy or a mistake. Delaying the mail is a federal crime. And I've seen extraordinary efforts on behalf of postal workers to move the mail and get it out because they understand more than most. I mean, I'll take this minute. During Hurricane Sandy, main facility for processing mail in New York City is the Morgan facility located between 28th and 30th Streets, 9th and 10th Avenue. It's a huge facility. It was in the area that there was a blackout. There was no electricity. I went over there with some union officials to check on how our workers were doing. We got there, no electricity, no lights, some emergency lights. We were going around the building checking on people. telling them if they didn't have to work in this condition, it was unsafe, they could go home. We got down to the loading dock. And what I saw, I couldn't believe. There were postal workers, truck drivers, and people assisting them, loading trucks, standing ankle deep in water. What happened if the power came on? We went over to them and said, you're not required to do this. The managers were standing in the back. It's their responsibility. The safety of the workers. They said nothing. They didn't do anything. They just watched it happen. So went over to a couple of truck drivers and said, this is unsafe. You can't do this and whatever. You should go home. You could get administrative leave. And they pointed, and there was these giant wire cages filled with mail, most of them medical prescription. They said, we have to get this to the people. The electronic lifts for the truck weren't there. They were pulling planks over, moving and loading the trucks and driving out to get the mail to post offices. Remember, no street lights, no traffic lights. These people were risking their lives to get people what they needed in the mail. I saw someone, and I said to her, what are you doing here? This is a senior guy. He didn't have to come in, had plenty of leave. He said, no, I came here to help. I said, how did you get here? He said he walked. He lived 12 miles away, and he walked to work.
Wow. Yeah.
Be there to help these truck drivers get. So when I see people, I'm sorry for getting emotional. But
you should get. Look, Chuck, I am sitting here thinking I'm feeling a sense of pride in listening to you talk about this, because you're basically talking about people taking. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish.
I just want to say during anthrax, postal workers died, bomb threats, all kinds of things. Postal workers do their job because they're committed. They take an oath, and they're dedicated to the mission of a prompt, reliable, and efficient service. This Postmaster General doesn't
Wait,
do
let
it.
me interrupt real quick because we have to take a break. Yeah. But look, I sit here and I'm listening to you, and I have a sense of pride and everything else and everything that you're saying, because those people are taking a responsibility to this country. And if that was a private enterprise, none of what you're talking about would happen. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice you were listening to was Chuck Zalakin, Legislative and Political Director, New York Area Postal Area Postal. We'll be back momentarily.
Fault Lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Legislative and Political Director of the New York Metro Area U.S. Postal Service Union. Chuck, I am so glad to have you here with everything that's going on, because you have been giving us a great description of the Postal Service, the commitment of Postal Service workers in regards to their jobs. And even when these guys are talking about overtime and everything else, the fact that that's the norm gets across a level of commitment to the job itself. DeJoy is an ideological actor. He didn't care about whether or not the Postal Service was going to work well or not. In fact, I would argue that it's the very opposite. He went in with the explicit intention of taking planks and injuring the Postal Service to make it less efficient for a competitive interest. I mean, we know he has stocks and companies that work against the Postal Service. The public is also, there's something else that needs to be understood. Public service is the highest ideal of the Postal Service, not this profit nonsense. That stuff is a private enterprise thing, not necessarily a postal thing. Did any of you, from the standpoint of your organization, consider going on strike? Now, I questioned this when it came down to when Trump took the money and said, look, I'm not going to pay airline workers because I'm going to take that money from the wall. And he declared a national emergency, shut down the government, even though he fully understood that, tens of thousands of people weren't going to get paid in the airline industry. And my first thought was, why don't they go on strike? Clearly, their job is infinitely necessary. And if those people said, if you're not going to pay us, fine. We're trying to protect this country and you're playing politics, and all of those people leave and every last airport across this country comes to a dead heat, they would be able to have some level of agency in the thing that they're doing, and they have relevance and agency in the process, as opposed to continuing to do the job. I understand in their heads, it might have been, I'm doing this job for America and everything else, but in real terms, they were being taken advantage of by a president and put into hardship because of it. Right now, with DeJoy in office, has the consideration of a strike, mass strike, all across the United States, bringing it to a halt, been brought up to consideration? Or is the thought being that if we do this, that is a power play, but that is a power play that could undermine our position, where private enterprise may actually be able to get a foothold based on that result or based on what happens from it? I'm trying to understand the internal politics that you guys have been thinking about in dealing with this issue of DeJoy.
Okay, well, I appreciate what you're saying, and but we try to be consistent with what we're talking about. Not like DeJoy who changes what he says depending on who he's talking to. But so if I can talk about the commitment to people, how do postal workers consider going on a strike during a pandemic when we've seen, letter carriers getting pictures drawn by kids and donuts and cake and thank yous, giant signs from people all around the country who are appreciative of the fact that postal workers, essential workers, are going to work, not knowing if they're going to get the virus themselves, not knowing if they're bringing it back to their families because they're out there dealing with this stuff. So on that level alone, what would that say if we went on strike when people desperately need medications and packages and vital supplies? So, in that sense, it's never really been discussed because, if you call the strike, it needs to be successful and people have to all go out. I don't see many of our workers going out because they're connected to the people. The letter carriers, they're known by the people on their route. They know their names, they know the families. They know if there's backed up mail, they'll go in and check and make sure that the people are okay. Extraordinary things that postal workers have done. So I understand the sentiment, and maybe in a certain sense it would be effective. But what's more effective now is people, not just postal workers, people expressing themselves, contacting elected officials. Now, tomorrow, there's a day of action where people are going to be standing at post offices all around the country. U.S. mail not for sale. You can go. My union has a connection. That's APWU, 4 letters, apw.org, and you can find out where rallies and demonstrations, even a few people holding a sign to let our elected officials know what the Postal Service means, and you can't not have the Postal Service. It's absurd that private entities, they don't like the fact that they are losing income, they think, because of the Postal Service, but there's no way that they could take it over with their so-called great efficiency and all this stuff. What is it that combined UPS and FedEx deliver like an entire year? What they deliver is just a small percentage of what the Postal Service delivers, and they use it for the last mile because they don't want to go to areas that's not profitable. So they'll put their stuff into the Postal Service. Have it
that's interesting, Chuck. Yeah, we were talking about that in the last segment. We were talking about that, but that's very interesting to hear that you're talking about the difference between USPS and UPS and FedEx, other private companies delivering mail, and the penetration of their services into these different areas. That's obviously one huge side of these things. Actually, with the history here, I wanted to go back to something. I'm just looking into this, and it seems like there was a really pivotal shift right around the reorganization of the post what used to be called the post office became the Postal Service back in the early 70s under Nixon. I'm guessing you know quite a bit about that. Is that right? It seems like there was this era during the Nixon administration that sort of kicked the early process of privatization. The sort of momentum on that got rolling during that period with this reorganization. Is that right? What happened?
Okay, well, first of all, up until 1970, 71 actually, the post was a department in the government, the post office department. And Jamal will be happy to hear this. Well, what changed it was the great giant postal strike of 1970, where postal workers went on strike because they were paid so poorly and had to go and lobby Congress to get any kind of raise. That a large majority of postal workers working full time were on public assistance. So there was a strike under Nixon. Nixon tried to bring in the military at one point to move the mail, but that was a disaster. So they settled it, and what was settled at that point was moving it from a department of the government into a independent agency, which the Postal Service is now. But also what they were doing, they were trying to depoliticize the post office. There was a lot of going on in the post office was impacted because of the fact that the Postmaster General was in the cabinet and was appointed by the president directly. So they set up a structure with the Postal Board of Governors and the separate agency to depoliticize the Postal Service, to get it to function as the independent agency that is, not under any party's influence. And that's the big change that we're seeing now, too. But yes, some people have said that opened the door to the beginning of privatization. But understand that, you know, there are people on who are pushing for privatization since the 70s. But it's ideological and business-wise. But I just want to say, too, if anyone's in the New York area and would like to come to the old Main Post Office at 8th Avenue and 31st Street at noon tomorrow to stand with all the people concerned, I'll be there and I'll say hello to you. But anyway, there's more to discuss here. But yes, that could have opened the door to privatization, but it also opened the door to collective bargaining and postal workers getting a living wage and an ability to work, with dignity. Second biggest employer in the country is the USPS. The first is Walmart. The difference is in Walmart, there's no union, so you don't have collective bargaining and no rights to protect yourselves on the job. The other big difference is that at your worker at Walmart, you're working to make sure that 6 billionaires keep getting their profits. You work for the Postal Service, and what your job is to deliver the mail to the people who own it. That's everybody in America. It's their post office. They own it. And we have to keep it that way all through this ebbs and flows of people who want to politicize it and also people who want to privatize it. But one thing privatization will bring, regardless of what Shane thinks, it'll be worse service and more money. It'll cost you
That's
more,
public
and
is
you'll
stuck
get
with,
less.
by the way.
Because they will not deliver the areas that are unprofitable because they don't do it now. And it's not just Amazon that gets the protected rate because they have such a huge volume, they get discounts. It's also UPS and FedEx get the same discount because they put in millions of pieces into the mail every year. So let's try and deal with the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is the Postal Service is a needed entity, even more so during a pandemic. And this nonsense that they're going to make it run better by sending out empty trucks, not hiring anybody, and eliminating overtime during a pandemic when you're heading into an election year. And also the Christmas season, there's a lot of use of the Postal Service. Everybody out there, it's your post office.
Chuck, before we go, we have about a minute and 30 seconds. I agree with you 1,000%. But I want to get one question before you go. I hear the passion in your voice on this. And there's something in me that goes off in this kind of little buzz, kind of like if I'm hearing Sanders speak and I hear something where it's this, I guess, collective action of sorts for the higher cause, where you're sublimating yourself to this higher goal and you're making a point that this is your postal service that they're destroying. And it is something that's a needle of vital interest. Explain something to me for the moment. Why did Bernie Sanders go along with voting for this bill back in 2006? Nancy Pelosi had the House, Harry Reid had the Senate. It was a bipartisan agreement, and they voted on it. Why did he do that?
Okay, well, why did he do it? Probably because at that point, Henry Waxman was someone who was a Democrat with a lot of liberal credentials, was one of the people pushing for it. It was bipartisan. I don't know how many, if any of the people who voted on it. This thing was voted on at midnight on the last night of the session when people were going home for the holidays, and some people were going home for forever, and the other house did it at 4 o'clock in the morning. People were voting to get out of it. I don't know how many of them knew what they were voting on.
That's fair.
Chuck, thank you so much for joining us. We've got to cut it out here. We've got to go. For everybody listening, that was Chuck Zlatkin from the New York Metro Area Postal Union. Website, apwu.org. That is the American Postal Workers Union, the second largest company in terms of private entity, basically, in terms of its number of employees. Big deal. Check their work out. Check out their protest tomorrow. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the politically independent corner, I am investigative journalist and radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get straight into it. In top headlines, we were just talking about this, but the House of Representatives passed a bill on Saturday giving $25 billion in emergency funds to the U.S. Postal Service and reversing recent cost-cutting operational changes. Democrats are seeking to reinforce the agency ahead of the November election when many voters are expected to cast mail-in ballots due to the coronavirus pandemic. The vote passed 257 to 150 in the Democrat-controlled House, earning some support from Republicans who expressed concerns about delayed mail. The bill is likely to meet significant opposition, however, in the GOP-led Senate. The rare Saturday session in in August, comes amid a national uproar over mail interference, putting the Postal Service and Postmaster General Louis DeJoy at the center of an unprecedented election year. The House will recess again until next month. A federal judge in Pennsylvania, meanwhile, has delayed the consideration of a lawsuit filed by President Trump's re-election campaign seeking a ban on drop boxes for mail ballots and on accepting ballots without a second internal secrecy envelope. The judge has said he would possibly resume consideration of the case before the election if other similar cases are decided beforehand. Down goes Kellyanne. By the way, Kellyanne Conway is out at the White House, a former campaign manager and longtime senior advisor to the president. Conway left, saying she needed to spend more time with her family. This came at the same time as Kellyanne's husband, George Conway, stepped down from the prominent anti-Trump group, the Lincoln Project, also saying he wants to spend more time with his family. This comes after, by the way, their 15-year-old daughter publicly pushed back on her mother's decision to speak at the RNC, saying that she, the daughter, may push for emancipation from her parents over the issue. So a family apparently getting torn apart by politics there. Sad to see that kind of thing happening. But, if you're in that high position, that will happen sometimes if you're pushed that much, especially this day and age, although really whenever. Anyway, next story, the Republican National Convention kicks off today in Charlotte, North Carolina. President Trump is planning to attend that event in person this afternoon before accepting the candidacy on Thursday from the South Lawn of the White House. However, he will also apparently be speaking every night at the event, mostly remotely, mostly not doing it in person. A huge number of Trump's family members are, by the way, joining him to speak at invention. Maybe we can come back to this tomorrow. It's kind of an interesting way of doing things.
It's funny.
Like that.
It's
Meanwhile,
funny. It's
Portland,
funny.
It is. Yeah, with Bidenism. Let's talk about this more after the thing. I want to compare Bidenism to this. There's another side of it too, but I heard a good point on this. Anyway, meanwhile, in Portland, last night you saw a major brawl as right-wing protesters and Antifa fought with bats and people lit a police station on fire. That is normally a much bigger headline, but that's kind of been a little bit normalized. It was the city's 88th consecutive night of protests, by the way. Meanwhile, over in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, they saw large protests yesterday after police in the city shot a black man in the back as many as 7 times in a row while they were responding to a domestic incident at about 5 p.m. on Sunday. Shot in the back while he was trying to enter his vehicle. After being shot, he was taken to the hospital. He was in serious condition. He is reportedly still alive there. But again, though, this shooting sparked same-day protests that moved into what some called riots, with cases of buildings burning and stuff like that distributed through different parts of the city. Anyway, sad to see all that stuff happening, different sides there. Sad that he got shot, first of all. Pompeo will be visiting the UAE today and Israel tomorrow to discuss the two countries' normalization of diplomatic ties and the topics of Iran and China. This, of course, comes after the UAE and Israel entered into diplomatic negotiations for the first time with the help of the United States. We also have had, of course, guests talking about what this actually means recently, whether this will really signal changes. This part of the thing is, we didn't mention this in the headline earlier. On Israel's side of the deal, they were basically postponing these annexations of different occupied Palestinian territories. Anyway, that was a large part of what was sort of at hand here internationally. From the global perspective, we'll see how that actually goes. A lot of guests have expressed some skepticism over the veracity of whether or not they're actually going to follow through on this. Anyway, officials in sort of related regional news, officials from the Syrian government, opposition, and civil society delegations, 3 delegations, 15 members each, will resume talks today in Geneva with the United Nations on either amending or rewriting the Syrian constitution. Major nations in the region, including Iran, Russia, Turkey, and the U.S. Hey, the U.S. might not be in the region, but we're a major power. Major powers in the region will be watching from the sidelines. Tropical storm Marco is expected to make landfall this afternoon along Louisiana's Gulf Coast. By the way, it of course will be followed soon after, in a very rare event, by Hurricane Laura. So rare back-to-back hurricane falls. National Hurricane Center in Florida says widespread coastal flooding is expected. This is hitting Louisiana pretty much square on. That seems to be the site that is expected to get hit hardest, although this is hitting the Gulf Coast. And again, that'll be going through the middle of the week. Wildfires, meanwhile, burn 1 million acres in California, with firefighters in at least 10 other states helping to combat at least 30 large fires in the state, sparked by lightning hitting parts of Napa. One of the fires in Northern California is the second largest fire on record. Fire personnel in the state has more than doubled, but they're reportedly still severely understaffed, with one spokesperson saying they could have as many as 5,000 firefighters there to help normally. But again, that's normally. Now they only have 1,500. So that's less than a third. That's a pretty damn sharp drop. And like I was saying earlier, what I've read about, and I want to get more specific numbers on like what percentage of the drop this would be caused by. What I've heard is that the prison population, which has been reduced due to the coronavirus, the prison population was formerly a large source of volunteer firefighters and sort of support for firefighters, and that's not happening right now with COVID, and that's partially explaining why they're so understaffed. And it's also, of course, explaining on the other side why the fires are so severe, why they're so out of hand. So just an interesting sort of side effect, literally just interesting to note. Another way of looking at this, real quick, we have time. I've heard it put that this is like we're an empire who has literally lost our slaves to do our firefighting. And so due to a plague, we're an empire that has lost the slaves that we would normally use to fight fires. Therefore, we have fires ravaging a region. I don't know, maybe technically accurate in a weird way. Definitely a perverse take on things, but yeah, from the global perspective. Anyway, last quick headline, also from the global perspective. Not sure of the truth status of this claim. Rumors are circling once again that Kim Jong-un is severely ill and maybe dead, and that if he's dead, that his sister would effectively be taking his position soon. Again, though, those are rumors, and these rumors circulate once every little while. Yeah, it's just interesting. Anyway, let's wrap the headlines there. You're listening to Fault Lines. Those are the headlines in our top news. Fault Lines with Thomas Shane Stranahan. And we're back. Oh, man. Okay, and we're taking calls. We're also talking about stuff. But if you want to call to join us, you can. 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. Let's go back to the RNC stuff for a second. So, yeah, like Melania, practically every member of his family is also speaking at this event. Just a lot of people. I'm going to pull up the list in a second. But what do you think about that? What do you think about that versus the DNC, which was everybody, I don't know, I'll put it like this. The DNC, which is a bunch of sort of establishment people, putting their full weight behind Biden, sort of congratulating him and complimenting him and recommending that, of course, that everybody vote for him. It seems like Trump is taking a lot more personal take here, bringing his family on, speaking himself every night. This isn't my take. Somebody was telling me about this, but what's your take on that, Jamarl?
I do think it's interesting. I'm not mad at Trump's take in regards to this is going to be about me because I'm the one that got to get elected. Now, Biden, God, this is what's so maddening about this. Let me start here first and I'll explain what I mean by it. Joe Biden is going to take an approach when he's running this race of balance. If Trump is attacking me on being weak, then I'm going to ride a bicycle. If Trump is attacking me on being by the left, meaning controlled by the left, I'm going to trot out a bunch of Republicans, and I'm going to trot out, like 50 Republican endorsements from people who are mainstream Republicans that basically get across, that's not going to be me. I'm going to tell my donors that you guys have nothing to worry about. I'm going to say all of that stuff because to some degree, it's all true. So I'm going to make it abundantly and explicitly clear, which means that the left gets frozen out because the left is irrelevant in this process. They're less than irrelevant. The moment that they were a captured audience and Sanders was gone, well, Joe Biden can do that, meaning he can lean out to those Republican voters in order to try to make that work. Whether it works or not is secondary. You also have this effect of, what's the other one? That I'm just going to defund the cops. And you have, of course, Kamala Harris, top cop on this campaign. So whereas Biden is taking a position, I'm going to blunt what Trump does. I'm going to be status quo and I'm just going to be Biden, whatever I do. Trump is not doing that. Trump is being who he is. So Trump is saying, yeah, here are my guys. These are the people who stood by me. These are the people who I like. And these are the people who I have some kind of allegiance to. And I'm going to be who I am. And I'm going to get elected doing that. So whereas one person runs a race where it's all negation and all running in relation to, Trump runs the way he wants to run. Win, lose, or in between. Now, I think he should pick up the populist message from 2016 about jobs and everything else, whether it's true or not. I think he needs a rerun of that. And I think he needs to abundantly, as president of the United States, take a U-turn and deal with the crisis in your country. Ameliorate those things. Get rid of those things. You're running into the election. Because if you do, it shows, at the very least, an accomplishment of competence. And beyond the accomplishment of competence, meaning you can do the job competently at a very basic level, you also blunt back many of the claims. I mean, a lot of the claims and a lot of the stuff that is being thrown against Trump is because they're calling him incompetent and you have all of these crises. You haven't been able to deal with those. If you can deal with those things, you enhance your chances of winning. It's not just optics, it's real world terms. But there's something to be said about running a race the way you want to run the race. Meaning make an affirmative case for yourself. For example, Sanders. Do you believe if Sanders ran the race, he would run it in a way where he has all of these right-wingers or corporate Democrats walking on stage? No. He would talk about Medicare for all, et cetera, because that's what he wants, regardless of the flack from it. Trump, for all of his faults, whatever you want to say about him, at least has the stones to run the race that is indicative of him. I have no faults in this. Even him running on every night. It's weird. It's funny. It breaks convention. I don't care. Let him do what he does and see how he comes out. But at the very least, he's willing to do it. So that's how I view it. And I'm sorry, I know it's a larger context, but that's kind of the way I process it when I'm seeing him do that. I prefer a president to run on what they believe in, not in this kind of, I want to blunt every other attack, so I'm going to waver on who I am in order to play politics. I don't want that. Tell me what you believe in, and let me say
he's doing it way more.
One way or the other.
He's doing it way more personally, but like you're saying, it's probably not going to get into policy. That's the thing. Is that we'll see. That's definitely not how the media is going to report it, and it probably won't be nearly as complete a fix for our problems as anybody would want in terms of what he's going to be talking about. But we'll see. We have a caller though. I think we should go to a call before we go into it because we've got Garland in just a couple of minutes. So while I've got time, we should take it. We've got Ingrid calling in from D.C. talking about Kenosha, Wisconsin. Ingrid, you're on. What's going on?
Yeah, hey. I don't know what your source was for Kenosha, but it's getting you off to a bad start. It was definitely a riot, and the way that it's framed, it's going to be one of these tense things where people are going to disagree a whole lot about this shooting, because this guy was not getting into a car. He was leaning into a car, possibly to retrieve a weapon. Total flames. The rioters burned up a car lot with at least 50 cars, almost burned down a church, burned up a restaurant, knocked out glass in countless store fronts, threw a brick and hit a policeman in the head, flattened him. It's definitely a riot, and I want to apologize. I'm not going to stick my neck out and give any kind of pronouncement on this, because I did that once to my regret. Lee was right about the shooting that was, I guess, Georgia, the Wendy's incident. Awful, tragic, unfortunate case, but sadly legal. And this is going to be another one of those debates.
Well, yeah, there are a ton of those debates. Yeah, we pretty much steered clear of that stuff largely. I think when we came in, this was like 2 months into the BLM stuff, to the like resurgence of this. I mean, I guess there are totally other sides to it. I don't know. I haven't looked too closely into George Floyd. That was like a large bone of contention between Lee and Garland. I can see the excited delirium case, but just watching the footage, it has always felt and seemed to me like a murder. And factually, I don't know. If anything, obviously the bare minimum is that you should reconsider the whole knee on the neck thing. But of course, there's also, I don't know, there's a lot longer conversation. We've got to go into a break. Any take, Jamarl, or should we just, you want to just go out?
Let's go to the break, and I'll get my take when we come back. But thank you for calling, Ingrid.
All right.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan.
We're going to go into a break. Yeah, Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. You guys are listening to
back.
Thomas. Oh, there we are. I didn't hear you at first when you were coming in. When there was dead air, I just kind of took it.
We're back. No, pardon me. I tried to hand the baton off to you right as we were going out there, but no, I'll bring him in. We've got Garland Nixon joining us. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. That's right here on Radio Sputnik, by the way. Garland, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Wonderful. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. Yeah, great to have you. All right, we're talking about Democrats, progressives, the left in the United States right now, and specifically, apparently, Democrats rejecting the progressive line. Do you see this? I'll start it off this way. Do you see this as the left establishment, the left quote unquote in the U.S. pushing away the real left, or is there some other way? How do you see this, Garland? What is your take on fundamentally the situation in the U.S. with the left as an entity?
Well, here's, I think, what happens. You know, if you define the left by policy, right? How do we define the left? You know, what's happened in America is we've defined the right and the left through the Democratic Party. Only through the lens, the left is defined through the lens of the Democratic Party. The right is defined through the lens of the Republican Party. So right and left now don't mean anything. They mean which party are you in, which isn't real. The rest of the world, there is true. You go to that's why you go to other countries and you have a number of parties. One will be center, one will be left, one will be right, one will be far right. You can tell who they are based on policy. In America, we've gotten it down to two parties, and we just say this is the left, this is the right. And even those two parties, over the course of time, can drift further to the right or drift further to the left. Well, clearly right now the Democratic Party's planning and doing a pretty good job of it, of drifting further to the right. They are kind of rejecting. If you look at their convention, The convention was, let's drift to the right, let's bring on Republicans, and we will try to attract Republicans. And the Republican Party, consequently, have drifted a little bit further to the right, but they were a right-wing party already. So I think, to some extent, what we have is right-wing and center-right as far as the two parties when it comes to most policies. There is some left-leaning rhetoric from the Democratic Party, but policy-wise, they have completely abandoned any pretenses of being a lefty party.
I want to respond to Ingrid for a moment. Okay, go ahead, Shane. Push back.
Oh,
no, push back, because I'm going to take it to a different place. But push back.
This might be a good conversation. Totally.
Yeah. Push back on Garland. Jump on Garland. Garland's on that network. He's on the show. Jump on him. Get on him.
No, so I don't see it as center right versus right in the United States. What I see it as is sort of each side moving closer towards what the establishment of the other side would want, where you have a single establishment entity that is sort of trying to co-opt the parties progressively, and of course it already has to a very great degree. But then what you have is some fundamental grassroots on the left and the right that are each trying to pull it in the opposite direction. So I don't think, is there different ways in which, for instance, I don't know, part of this is complicated. We'd have to debate what the left and the right are in the sort of abstract process. But what I'm saying is I see people on the right with some validity in a lot of cases, seeing their party being moved to the left. But what I see happening fundamentally is just each party being co-opted by the establishment and the establishment's interests, where the left and right, as real sort of ideological entities, however you want to look at it, as these different actual dimensions of different political thought with roots, with history, with policies fundamentally, with ways they want the country to work. I see them each sort of being shafted to a large extent. That's my take. But what's yours, Rahm?
Well, and that's the other thing. See, I tend to not view this. I tend to view this through the perspective of class. The working class, the wealthy class. And in fact of the matter is, I'd say speaking for the Democratic Party right now. They're making it clear that they view this through the lens of class. They're saying we're going to get the suburban. That's not the very poor people in the rural areas. That's not the poor people in the cities. They're saying suburban. They're talking about a very particular demographic that is both mainly economic, but somewhat race also. But so here's a couple things. There was a very interesting article out recently, and it was on CNBC, and it was an interview with Rahm Emanuel, where he said a number of things, not the least of which he said this. This will be the year of the Biden Republican, said Emanuel, citing the appearances of John Kasich, Colin Powell, and Cindy McCain at the Democratic convention. The other thing he said was, quote, Democrats must not only attract Republican voters who want to put Trump out of office at the end of his first term, but retain those voters under the party's big tent, said Emanuel. So what he's saying is this. We are shifting to the right. You know good and well that if you go towards the, quote, moderate Republican, that you're going away from progressives from a policy perspective. And what he's saying is this is intentional. But what he's also saying is, and after we get those, we got to keep them. So what he's saying is we got to get elected without the progressives. Then after we get elected, we've got to stay to the right. So A, we got to get rid of the progressives now, and B, if we can keep a few for votes, that's fine. But if we get elected, we got to completely purge the party of these people and just move on to the right, to the as they call the moderate Republicans. And it's an attempt to completely realign the party, to purge it of progressives, and to move to what they see as the establishment. Republicans, basically, to bring the establishment together of both parties into one party, to reject the say populist left or populist right once and for all. That's what it sounds like to me.
You're right, and it's rational when you think about it. The progressives aren't going anywhere, so they would vote blue no matter who, and all this other stuff. They've accepted and drunk the Kool-Aid. They are the political equivalent of a battered wife. And just like a battered wife who see the husband mess around with the maid, not wash his hands when he fixes his kid's ham sandwich, refuses to pick the kids up after school, and you find him in a bar blowing the entire rent money, and you stay with him because he tells you, honey, you can never find anyone else, and you stay with him. That's what progressives are. That's what lefties are, who can take all of this and still vote for Biden regardless of what happens. So it's rational for the Democratic Party, who was terrified that Sanders was going to take it, doesn't think it can keep these lefties corralled, just make the basic point of saying, all right, we're fine. We need to go and get a group of people that is within the context of our ideology where it's not that much of a fight. And they reach out to Republicans. Biden did it on the stage. And in all honesty, the status quo of it all does fit more soundly with basically a Republican Party minus the social and identity stuff. So I agree with you 1,000%. And I just want to add that I think it's rational. One thing, though, I want to get to because we're running out of time. I want to respond to the caller's comment, Ingrid. So the first thing she brought up is Rashard Brooks in Wendy's and basically illegal murder. That Rashard Brooks had a taser. That taser didn't have the ability to put down anybody, or at the very least not to kill, and they put multiple bullets in him. Now, you can ask two questions. What is our society willing to accommodate? And clearly, cops kill 1,000 people a year. 1% of those cops have some kind of legal difficulties, and even a smaller percentage of that gets any kind of jail time. So she's right in one context that says, look, in America, you can murder a person, whether or not that person has the ability to kill you or not is secondary. He fought, he ran, fair game. A larger question is, should that be the case? Since law is ultimately not real and is changeable when we get and grow as a society to determine whether that's true or not. The second case she's talking about, you can watch the video. You can watch the video. This is not conceptual. Leaning in his window, the Washington Post even reports it. You see him trying to break up a fight between two women or whatever. Something happens and you see cops appear on the scene, two of them. He is going to his car. They're shooting him in the back as he's opening the car door, trying to get in, and his kids watch. Flat fact of what happened. Now, you can add coloring to it and say, well, maybe he was reaching for a gun. I don't know why you would make that assumption, but okay. Maybe he was doing this, maybe he was doing that. The flat fact of it all is a man was shot in the back 7 times while his kids watched as he was trying to get into his car. He was unarmed. And you could say, well, the cops thought he was trying to reach for, I don't know, any of that stuff. I'm telling you what actually happened. You're telling me that he takes 7 bullets and he's reaching for a gun to return fire after taking 7 bullets in the back. Okay, he's Batman. Fair enough. Garland, you've seen the video, I would imagine, at this point. What did you think of this? And did you think of this that, okay, those cops were justified because those cops were fearing for their lives at this unarmed man trying to get into his car?
Well, certainly not. But here's the thing here's the issue, that police shootings and the response to police shootings in the United States have become a farce. It's become a joke, wherein any police shooting culturally through most of American culture, any police shooting is assumed to be justified, is assumed to be a reasonable shooting, even in the most absurd circumstances. So now where we are in America is, a person is walking away and clearly you can see the evidence. There is no evidence of threat to the officers, but all they have to do is articulate some kind of a threat. It doesn't matter. Well, I thought he was going to fill in the blank. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's not relevant. If you look at the video, you can see there's no reason to make an assumption that he was doing anything other than walk. You know what he was doing. Any assumptions about anything else is pure blind conjecture. However, in America, it has become a society where blind conjecture can easily be applied when there is a police shooting, and it's always applied in a manner that is in the benefit of the officer, never the other way around. You could come up with blind conjecture, or excuse me, you don't need blind conjecture in this instance. Just say, what happened? Well, it's fairly obvious. So people can just say the officer thought he was going to, and just fill in anything. It doesn't matter. And there are a lot of people in our country that all they want to hear is that fill in anything. The officer thought he was going to turn into a werewolf. Oh, there you go. He could have torn everybody to shreds, so the officer had to shoot him. It doesn't matter how you finish that sentence anymore in America. It's just accepted.
Garland,
okay,
I think the saddest part is that we accept that. I think the saddest part is we accept that. Like, it's for example, I would argue that the police are basically similar to the post office in some similar way. They're a public service of sorts. And as a public service, whereas the post office has this highest ideal of America of we want to get this mail, we care about the public, we know there's all of these important things, it seems that the cops don't appropriate it in those terms. And I get it to some degree. We can push them to do a job that they can't fundamentally do because there's no way for them to stop crime. They're always reactive to that stuff. And so it's like, we need you to go, we don't want to deal with the poverty in our society, so we want you to deal with the edges of it. But there still should be some ethos, some idea in their heads that as we engage our society, we want to the highest ideal to keep people safe. And if that means that sometimes we need to get into dangerous situations where we need to pull firearms or tasers or whatever, your society understands that, which is why we allow you to keep those things. But by the same token, we still want a certain faith that you operate with the notion of the highest ideal of the person. Meaning, if there is any way for you to get out that situation where you don't kill that person, then it should be legal, rational, implied by law, explicit, that you take that chance. Meaning, if this man is not have a weapon, he's not trying to shoot us, then maybe you don't take that shot. Maybe you try to find another way to do your job that doesn't end with him dying. And maybe your society should expect that, as opposed to expecting, well, that guy reached for a donut, and so, well, that guy reached for his license, so it's fair game. Or the favorite one, he should have did exactly what the officer said. Otherwise, it is fair game to put a bullet in him, regardless of what he was doing. Like, those things, I think, are problematic for society, and those society needs to develop beyond just believing that it doesn't matter what the person does. If it's beyond any scope of what the cop said, that person is fair game to be executed with maximum justice. You were a cop.
Yeah.
How did you deal with these issues, and how do you frame this stuff when you think about these disasters that take place?
Well, as a cop, my perspective was always this: not can I use force, but should I use force? Because in America, what it's come to is with law enforcement, something happens and it's can I use force? Is it justifiable? Not should I do it? Not is it something that needs to happen? Should it happen? Are there other alternatives? It's can it be justified? And as long as you're saying can, it's almost like saying, if somebody says, can I get away with this? There's no difference. Can I do this and walk away? So our officers aren't even trained, should they? They're trained, can I? When can you use force? Well, that's almost an invitation to use force.
You guys have been listening to The Voice.
We've got to cut it. That was the voice of Garland Nixon. Thank you, Garland. Thank you for joining us. We've got to go, but I really appreciate you joining us. Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. That's right here on Radio Sputnik, by the way. And that's 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific. So that's my time. Anyway, we're going to go into a break right now. We'll be back in a minute with Danny Scherzen. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. We're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Scherzen. We're joined for this segment and the next by Danny Scherzen, retired U.S. Army officer and former history instructor at West Point. Danny, how are you doing this morning?
Great.
Joining us. By the way, for those listening, Danny Scherzen, again, you can follow him on Twitter at Skeptical Vet. That's his handle, Skeptical Vet. And you can check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill, that is co-hosted with fellow vet Chris Henry Henriksen. But again, on Twitter, Skeptical Vet. Also, you write all the time over at Anti-War, right, Danny? Isn't that your main sort of hub?
Yeah, that's my weekly column. Kind of things start there and then they bounce around. But that's sort of the place where I can, get out what's on my mind. And I've got a lot of sort of editorial control over there, and it's a great spot.
Cool. And for those listening, that is antiwar.com. Yeah, and usually if you go over there and you just do a quick search for his name, you'll find what he's talking about. And I'm over there now and I see him right up top. So yeah, that usually holds true. Anyway, thank you again for joining us. Danny Scherzen. We're talking about the United States, the Democratic Party, and its war propensities, but also whether the United States' war propensities are uniquely Democratic, Republican, whether they're sort of equally distributed across both parties, how that's changed over the recent years, and then of course, taking that broader perspective, looking at Biden, looking at 2020, what would happen either way? How would each president potentially being elected? How would that affect our geopolitics and our propensity to get into wars? Danny, just real quick, starting off the top, looking at Biden, looking at Trump, what's your take? Which would be more likely to incite some kind of international conflict?
Well, listen, I think that Donald Trump is legitimately a major threat domestically and internationally. So everything that I say that's critical of Biden, must be kind of couched in the understanding that at the very least, Trump's, climate denial, character flaws that really make him a loose cannon, and just Venezuela and Iran hawkishness make him really disqualified as president. However, that being said, we should tell the truth about what a Joe Biden foreign policy might well be. We can't predict the future perfectly, but we know his past record of just really genuine hawkishness, and we know who his foreign policy team, includes. And so this is like the neoliberal retread. We have Biden, who is saying nothing will change, right, if I get elected, essentially, and that we're going to be tougher on China than Trump. And, there's some positive rhetoric here and there, but I think you can expect probably just as tough of a Russia policy, if not an overcorrection from the perception, I think mostly false, that, Trump has been weak on Russia. And I don't think that we're going to, we are not going to see under a Biden presidency a remaking of American policy. The empire is not going anywhere. The emperor just might be a little more polite. So I think that's the key takeaway. So I don't want to say that, hey, we're better off with Trump because I have critique of Biden. Like, Trump has to go. But boy, I wish we had a better choice on foreign policy than Biden and Blinken and Michelle Flournoy or whoever else is going to come in from sort of the neoliberal, overthrow Libya crowd in the Democratic Party.
So that's Danny. That's part that confuses me about this stuff. Growing up, I'm still a relatively young dude, but growing up, again, pretty recent history at this point. I thought of the Democratic Party as the anti-war party in the United States. No qualms about stating it so bluntly. That's how I felt. That's what I thought until pretty recently, until maybe the past half decade or so. Now, I had some earlier reservations on economic issues, all that other stuff, but still, when it comes to war, that's what I thought. 2016 and maybe a little bit earlier, but 2016 at the latest completely undid that. I think it has for a lot of people. I think looking at the Democrats agitating for war against Russia, it's not like the Republicans look better necessarily, because of course China is their boogeyman, but still agitating for war against Russia. They're no longer squarely anywhere in the anti-war camp. How did that happen? When would you peg that? You think I'm right in the rough time frame there, but what do you think, more importantly, what do you think actually happened there to cause that shift?
Wait, Danny, just in one more case, I just want to add one more thing to Shane's point. And was there a shift at all? I mean, if we're thinking of Truman that dropped the nuclear bomb, it was LBJ that was in the war in Vietnam. It was very explicit that he wasn't getting out of the war and browbeat McNamara.
Totally.
It was Obama that went through the other countries like Libya and everything else. So, I mean, I guess, can you answer this in two ways? I guess, was it the war party? And if it wasn't the war party, when did it become the war party? I just wanted to interject, just add on to your question. I'm sorry.
And in 5 seconds, my experience really was 2002 and the Iraq War, where there seemed to be something principled about that. But that's limited, and I'm not saying something wider than that. But anyway, Danny, please.
Okay, so I think here's the thing to remember is there has never been really an anti-war political party among the, in America's duopoly, the shifting duopoly. The Democratic Party was never really an anti-war party. That myth was actually kind of thrown at them by the Republican Party in more recent years, and really about 60 or 70 years. It's been used effectively, but especially since Nixon. And so the idea was, we'll paint the Democrats as weak doves, and then they'll have to sort of overcorrect. They'll have to overcorrect, because actually war sells in terms of votes initially, and then it has diminishing returns. The Democratic Party has really only established itself as this really, truly anti-war for only a few elections. 1972, George McGovern, which was seen as a big mistake by the Democratic establishment because he got, the floor wiped with him by Nixon. And then maybe, around 1900, around the Philippine War as a reaction against imperialism there, William Jennings Bryan. I mean, you can't point to very many other elections where the Democratic candidate was an anti-war candidate. And there's been a couple of key moments that have sort of proved this to be the case. In 2006, I was in Iraq at the end of that year. I was in Iraq for the election in November. I, too, had fallen for sort of the myth that, well, it's the Democrats that will save us, right? They're the anti-war party. And they did, in fact, run on what was kind of like a litmus test election, kind of a referendum on the Iraq war. And that was the number one issue. And that almost never happens, where foreign policy is the number one issue in a midterm congressional election. But it was in all the polls. Democrats sweep the houses of Congress on a mandate to end the Iraq war. And what did Nancy Pelosi, who was the speaker then too, what did she say in her first week after the election? She said, I will not. She took it off the table. She said, I will not cut the funds to the Iraq war. Will not do it. Well, you were elected to end that war. So what this showed is the Democrats, just like the Republicans, will use anti or pro-war policies as appropriate to the electorate, what's popular, in order to win an election. But a principled candidate or a principled policy has always been the exception rather than the rule. So what you have is you have two parties that are war parties that occasionally their anti-war wing, which exists in both parties, libertarian right and far, relatively progressive left. There's always been an anti-war thread that they have to nod to in each party, occasionally in each of the parties. And it is very occasional. That wing is elevated and sort of takes charge. But that's the right way to see it from a historian's perspective. And I don't think there are a whole lot of accredited historians who would disagree with that. So the Democratic Party is not a peace party. That is a myth. Republicans have used it to say how weak they are. But if you want to know that it's not true today, all you have to do is look at a Democratic-led vote that said we will cut the funds if you try to end the war in Afghanistan. Not that we'll cut the funds if you try to fight a forever war. We're cool with that. But if you try to take us out of Afghanistan, we'll cut the funds. And then a bipartisan vote that said no to a 10% cut amendment to the defense bill, which was voted against. The 10% minimal cut to the defense budget was voted against not just by most of the Democrats, but most of the Democratic combat veterans of those wars, despite the fact that 73% of those veterans are now for full withdrawal from Afghanistan. So that's a lot of stuff to say. But the conclusion is neither party is anti-war. They have anti-war wings, which are usually suppressed. There's only been a few examples where that has not been the case.
Basically, suppressed or elevated for political gain at any particular moment. Like, if it's advantageous to be anti-war, then for the most part, you let those lefties float to the top, even though they don't have any necessary control in the mix on that. Well, let me ask you this. What if this was under Obama? I'm curious. Do you think this is entirely politics, where everyone is just relative to everybody else? Where if Obama was in office and Obama said, you know what, we're going to get these troops out of Afghanistan, just like Trump. Let's say he was thinking exact same thing that Trump did. We're going to try to get these troops out of Syria. We're going to steal the oil, but we're going to get the troops out, for the most part. Do you think that the political pushback that he experienced from basically the media and the political class that basically told Trump no, and even was leaking documents to try to, screw up mess it up. Do you think that the same thing would have taken place if a Democrat was in office and pushing those particular policies? Would that Democrat had enough support from the military and political space or the media space to even pull that off? Meaning it's impossible to do it with just basic politics, and that you do in fact need a movement to kind of pressure the political system to do it.
One of the main determinants of whether a party moves is grassroots street activism. It's not the thing they're most responsive to, but most of the time when there's a push for a party to kind of become anti-war or at least play up their anti-war wing, it's because the people have really started stopping traffic, quite literally. We are not going to find salvation, the great men, and they're still mostly men atop either political party. We're just not going to. They are not particularly responsive, and unless you do kind of sit in the streets, not much happens. But the number one determinant of either party, we'll take the Democrats because they're it's kind of obscene example. I mean, the Republicans right now are a monstrous party in many ways. I mean, they're a party of death, so many levels. However, Democrats are really instructive from like a political calculus. The number one determinant in recent history, and maybe always, of whether a Democratic, Congress is for or against a war or a war policy is whether the president is someone they like, and is whether it's someone from their party. So, in other words, the Iraq war is bad when Bush is in charge of it. The Afghan war is good when Obama's in charge of it. Regime change is bad when Bush pushes it. Regime change is good if Obama pushes it in Libya. If Obama was trying to pull out of the Afghan war, we would see things flip, right? We wouldn't see the Democratic Congress cut the funds to pull the troops out, which is an odd inversion of just farce and potential evil. So, I mean, that just shows you how craven political figures these folks truly are and how beholden to the moneyed interests these people are. We love our veterans. We adulate them. We put them on jumbotrons. But you know what that is? That is cosmetic. Because if we loved our veterans, we create less broken versions of them, like nearly everyone who served with or under my command. We would listen to them when the veterans of these very wars have turned against those wars at a magnitude maybe never seen, and certainly never seen in modern American history since the tail end of the Vietnam War. But we ignore those veterans. 73% of veterans in a Republican poll, in a conservative poll, say that they're against the war in Afghanistan.
Danny, let me bring you back. And I want you to tell me the exact same thing about this poll on our way back. You guys have been listening to Danny Surgeon, retired U.S. Army officer and former history instructor at West Point. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision-makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We've been speaking with Danny Surgeon, retired U.S. Army officer and former history instructor at West Point. These are always really interesting conversations. You can pick up, or you can find Danny on Twitter at Skeptical Vet, and you can check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill, co-hosted with Chris Henry. I love that name, Fortress on a Hill. Danny, please continue. We were having this conversation about people loving their vets in the intellectual frame. But when it comes down to it in real brass tacks, loving your vet is not putting him in that horrible condition. Loving your vet is ensuring you're taking care of him when he gets older or he comes back broken either intellectually or physically. That's what loving your vet is. That's a policy thing. That's a specific policy orientation, not just a flag wave. Am I correct on that?
Well, absolutely. What I was saying is that, and I think this is key, if we in fact love our veterans so much that we're going to almost like fawn over them and really like almost a disturbing and like militarist fetishization, then one would think that if once 70% of the veterans of said wars had said enough, this far and no further. We support full and almost immediate withdrawal from Afghanistan. One would think that this anti-war Democratic Party, right, or the super pro-military Republican Party would say, you know what, we should probably take that into account. Maybe it is time to go. That is not what happened. So that tells you who they serve, right? Bob Dylan, you got to serve somebody. Well, we know who both parties in the establishment really serve, and it's military-industrial complex interests and the think tanks that they fund. This is a reality, and then it's a political calculus. Whatever they think is going to sell, and if they can win points by hitting Trump, or if they can win points by hitting Bush, or if the Republicans can win points by kind of smacking down Obama, that's what they're going to do. And so this is an obscene situation, and it is clear that even the voices of the adulated veterans are not enough to push us out of, say, a war in Afghanistan. The Democratic Party, in my opinion, just real quick, they're a party that will say the right things about identity politics and Black Lives Matter and all that, and that's great, and we need to move there. But war policy is the last truly bipartisan enterprise.
I think one of the most interesting things as we have this conversation is that oftentimes people hear me make the argument that class and race are intrinsically linked. You can't separate those things, even though you get political parties that try to do so. Well, war, or let's say geopolitics and corporate interests, are also intrinsically linked. A corporation that wants to get his hands on a resource or wants to get his hands on some kind of service, let's say like the NHS, or for that matter, let's say like bananas in South America, well, those things require almost a geopolitical or militaristic arm in order to make that a reality, when you can't necessarily do it just through basic capitalistic means. One of the interesting things is in Starship Troopers, I know this is a weird term, my wife and I were watching this the other day, the veterans in that movie, if anybody ever listened to the premise as opposed to just watching it, my wife just watches it and I'm infatuated with the premise. The veterans came together to basically change society because society couldn't do it on its own. And as you make this argument that says, look, 70% of the vets that were involved in these wars say, stop. It's not worth it. If it's one thing where people kind of armchair military, right? And they'd be like, well, we could go and we could just do some bombing there and some bombing there. And it's like, are you going to serve? No, I'm not. I'm not going to get involved in that at all. And never quite understand what it means to go to war, what it means to put your uncle, brother, sister, mother, or whatever into somebody else's country in order to subjugate or anything else, and putting those people in horrible conditions. They will have to kick open a door one day. They will have to fire in a particular spot one day. They may end up doing horrendous things, not because they were horrendous people, but because of the situations they were in. So, I appreciate the way you explain this to the public of basically making the point to saying, look, this needs to stop. This can't be something that continues to go on in this. From your vantage point, and you're looking at this, why don't those vets have like a union? Or do those vets have some organization where these guys come back and these guys are still tightly linked together with one another, however they come back? And do they talk about politics? And I understand the military is supposed to be apolitical for various reasons, but they're still human beings. And like you said, when they take those polls come back basically saying we don't agree with the policies that these guys push. Has the military or people coming back from that military, veterans, ever come together under this notion almost similar to a union in order to push for what they think is right or wrong, especially from the interests of people who actually went to war?
Not really. There is no union, obviously, of troops, and there's very little, politically or policy inflected veterans organizations that, folks get into when they leave the military. So you have things like the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. These become social clubs to a large extent, maybe sort of charity organizations for helping, veterans personally. And then you have small anti-war organizations like Veterans for Peace or about-face Veterans Against the War. In general, veterans have had a difficulty organizing, partly because there's divisions. They're not a monolith, right? So they don't all agree with me, although largely and increasingly they do, even if for not the exact same reasons. There have been a couple of examples of times that they have done so. And so the bonus march during the Great Depression when they were saying, we want the money that was promised to us after World War I. These were World War I veterans, and we want it from Congress now, and we're going to march on Washington. And, tens of thousands did. That was a rare example, and of course they were dispersed in the streets by General Douglas MacArthur at the orders of President Hoover with tear gas and bayonets, and some people were killed, including an infant child. But that's rare. So I think what the key here is that veterans do have a power. It is largely not mobilized, but it is a potential that's there, and we need to start thinking about it. The Starship Troopers analogy is important because what it demonstrates is that when you go to a professionalized warrior class, which really becomes a caste, C-A-S-T-E, you divide the military from its people. And that civil-military gap can become a formula for one of two things, mainly forever war, which is what we're seeing now because most people aren't invested, so they don't care if we stay at war forever. But the danger other side is military coup. I'm not saying that will happen, but that is one of the predictions of most dystopian novels about what happens when you create a Praetorian Guard warrior class. So I think those are the real threats, and this is a very, very disturbing situation we found ourselves in, where our military is a lot more like a foreign legion than it is a citizen soldier enterprise.
God, I love that you said that. Shane,
well,
please
I
take
think
over.
Actually, when most people are using the
No, I'm sorry. Please take
What's
over.
that?
I was just saying, yes, I'm glad you said that because he's right. He's right all the way through. I love it.
Yeah, well, and but usually the thing is usually when people bring in the Praetorian Guard and they draw allusions to America, usually they're referring to like the deep state, the CIA, the NSA, but it would also apply to some, to some branches, the higher up, so to speak, in the Pentagon, in the DoD. Is that right? Briefly, Danny, I wanted to go to political philosophy for a second, but is that broadly right, or where do you think that term would actually apply in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I mean, when people talk about the deep state, you're right. Usually there's this civilian defense officials at the highest levels, intelligence for sure. But, these lines have blurred with the military. And so because as our special forces has grown in such volume to the point where it's unclear what makes them special any longer, right? But they're very large. And then also the kind of senior military level where there's such a revolving door between them. And of course, not just the corporate side, think tanks and to some extent Congress connections. So, I would say the senior uniformed service members and then some of the special forces higher ups probably should be considered part of this deep state enterprise to the extent that that word is relevant. But whatever you call it, whatever phrase you like, it exists. And
it's an influential political bloc. Yeah, like you're saying, elites from different sectors. And I think what's especially weird for people in terms of thinking about it is the sort of continuity, the contiguousness between the public and the private sector, between military intelligence and corporate intelligence, between these different spheres of activity. I actually wanted to go somewhere else for a second, though. I wanted to go to political philosophy for a second, specifically this issue of nationalism and this shift, which I see as a technological shift, but I'll put it in these terms. Historically, pretty much everybody has known. Poets throughout history, for instance, have described how the leaders of societies have gone to war despite effectively everybody else in those societies, especially the lower classes, but especially effectively everybody else in the societies not wanting to go to war. It's the interests of the elite, and that seems to have dominated throughout history. The sort of public's take on war is that it's not something they want; it's something that the elites do for their own interest. And maybe I'm getting stuff wrong here, but I want to make a point and get your response to it. And then we moved into I'm going to simplify things dramatically. In the 19th century, we moved into this sort of era of nationalism. You saw Napoleon, you saw the rise of these mass armies of, conscripted soldiers who were sort of fighting with the cause and who were culturally at least seen as being at one with the interests and the motivations of Napoleon, the leader of the French state. And it seems like we've been sort of living in this field where through democratic representation, we're supposed to get into wars that are, that we approve of, that the public approves of. Right off the bat, there are a couple of problems with that conception. There are always all these different ways to poke holes in it. But it seems to have gotten especially gratuitous because within the last couple of decades, at the latest, arguably over just the last century, we've become so disintermediated from our wars. Maybe post-Vietnam, especially post, say, 2000, so many of our wars are fought not by soldiers on the battlefield, but by very small numbers of elite groups who who are working with, locals in countries to sort of suppress unrest, to do these different actions. In other words, you don't need these conscripted armies. And with that, you don't need the public support for war. So from this grand philosophical standpoint, do you see that shift? Do you see that this change in the relationship between people and the government in terms of this interest? Or, again, we only have about a minute left, but where would you take that, Danny, historian, looking at this?
What I like that you're mentioning here is that we've kind of come full circle. So prior to the rise of nationalism and citizen armies with the French Revolution, these were the king's armies, right? And they were largely mercenary, and they were professionalized and or mercenary. And then we had this kind of brief foray for a few centuries of the people being involved in war. But I would argue, since we're short on time, that you will see through the use of our contractors, special forces, and this sort of elite and professionalized military, a blurring of those lines, so that we're kind of back to the king's wars and the king's men, so to speak, fighting on behalf of a citizenry that is neither interested nor informed about that fight.
That is exactly, you know what, Danny? Thank you for picking up that. I'd love to come back on that conversation at some other point. I think that's a very interesting side of this stuff, looking at the history, but we'll have to come back on it. That was the voice of Danny Scherzen. He's a writer, also a retired U.S. Army officer and former history instructor at West Point. You can follow him on Twitter at Skeptical Vet, and you can check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill, co-hosted with his fellow vet, Chris Henry Henriksen. We will be back tomorrow. We're out. This is the last hour this morning of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, thank you for joining me, as always. Fault Lines. It felt like we had a really, really good show today with really high energy, and it felt like the conversations and everything else. When we have a conversation, and it gets all the way to the edge, and we have to force it to stop, at that point, the conversation, I would argue, is pretty good, at the very least to each other. And my belief is that if it's good between us, then the people who are joining us, who are on that particular wavelength, will also get something good out of it, not to mention the guests and everything else. So it sounds like we had phone issues a little bit earlier in the show, but everything else resolved and ended up being absolutely rosy. So I want to thank all of you for joining us for the show. Our numbers on the show have been growing. This network is almost at 30,000, meaning my channel is almost at 30,000. You guys have made that possible, and I really want to thank you for it. Coming up next week after surgery, as I've been telling you that I would, again on the 28th. I'm going to have to get a COVID test on the 26th. But after that, and once the thing's resolved for that, the medical issue should be resolved. Again, I'll consider this temporary. It's just changing mufflers or whatever. And ultimately, anytime there's pain or problems, you try to focus on when it stops, within a month, within 2 months, whatever. And then at that point, you can at the very least have yourself trying to withstand it with the notion that it passes, as opposed to falling into the depression of this is going to be forever. Just a mental trick. You get used to it over the course of 20, 30 years. That's it. After that, though, I'm saying all of this for contributor appreciation. My wife and I are trying to figure out we can get that started in lieu of all the medical stuff. And so it should be over with next week. I do absolutely want to have one on my birthday. And I hope I hit 30,000 by my birthday to make it that much more awesome. And if so, we just, take a bunch of pain meds and we just do it out of the way. But nevertheless, I wanted to give you guys an update on what has been taking place. Fault Lines, Thomas Stranahan. We were able to bring on the Garland Nixon, the one and only himself. And you guys have a good day. I will see you guys probably in the next 30 minutes. Like, share,